She was 22 and homeless. No room, no scholarship, no address, just a horsehair bracelet on her wrist and $3 she had folded inside the photograph sleeve of her dead grandmother's Bible. And with that $3, she bought a horsehair jewelry studio forgotten on the north edge of Galena in Joe Daviess County, Illinois, a place the county surveyor had stopped marking after 1938. The back wall leaned 2 inches out of plumb. Rain came through the roof in 3 patient places. The county had said the building had been closed since 1979 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the largest cherrywood braiding loom, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 119 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Tova Elaine Mercer had been braiding her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she braided shoelaces while sitting on church steps, grass stems while waiting for her mother outside medical clinics, and the loose fringe of blankets during the long afternoons when grown people spoke in low voices beyond kitchen doors. She had the kind of hands that moved when the room became too still. They folded napkins into narrow fans, twisted grocery twine into cords, and separated threads from the hems of shirts too worn to mend. She was born in Dubuque on the Iowa side of the Mississippi, in a rented house with a crooked porch and a maple tree that dropped seeds into the gutters every May. Her mother, Lila, worked mornings at a dental office and evenings keeping books for a feed supplier, writing numbers into ledgers with a care that made every column look like a field planted straight. Tova learned early that money did not disappear loudly. It vanished by ounces in receipts tucked under magnets, in medicine bottles lined beside the sink, in envelopes opened twice before anyone spoke. The house was not poor in the way people liked to name from the outside. It was clean, nearly exact, full of careful meals and repaired things, but every object in it seemed to have been asked to last longer than it wanted to. Her father had been there at the beginning, and then had not. His name was Aaron Mercer, and in the photographs he stood beside Lila with a shy, capable look, one hand always in a coat pocket, as if holding something there for later. He drove delivery routes through eastern Iowa and northern Illinois, hauling boxed machine parts and seed catalogs, and once a church organ wrapped in moving blankets. When Tova was 5, a winter road took him near Stockton, where black ice laid itself across the asphalt like glass nobody had warned him about. After that, her mother's grief became practical. Lila did not wail. She paid bills, she cleaned the freezer, she folded his shirts into a cedar chest and placed lavender sachets between them as though he might come home tired and need them fresh. She taught Tova to rinse beans, to match coupons with store ads, and to keep one good dress ready for funerals, interviews and emergencies. There was no speech about endurance. There were just mornings. On Saturdays, when Leela worked double shifts, Tova rode the local bus to her grandmother's apartment above a narrow antique store in Galena. Her grandmother was called Morella Voss before marriage and Morella Mercer after it, though most people in town called her Miss Mirry because she had outlived the age when anyone needed permission to shorten a name. She was a compact woman with silver hair pinned in a knot, so exact it looked drawn, and she kept her rooms smelling of beeswax, black tea, and a faint clean animal scent Tova could never name until much later. Miss Mirry made horsehair jewelry. Not the souvenir kind sold near rodeo gates with bright beads and careless knots, but the patient Victorian mourning work that had once passed from hand to hand when a family wanted remembrance close to the skin. Horsehair came to her in bundles wrapped in paper labelled chestnut, bay, black, silver, roan. Some had been cut from living animals by owners who wanted a bracelet before a beloved horse grew too aged. Some came in silence after a burial, the tail washed, dried, tied, and sent with a note that said only the name. Miss Mirry treated every bundle the same way. On weekend mornings, she laid white cotton across the table and taught Tova to sort the strands by length, gloss, and willingness. That was the word she used. Some hair resisted, some bent easily, some could be trusted for the center of a braid, and some could only be used where the pattern turned and needed forgiveness. The first step was washing. Miss Mirry heated water in a dented enamel pot and clipped a candy thermometer to the side at 180 degrees, never boiling. She lowered the hair with a wooden fork and let it soften until the room filled with a grassy, mineral warmth. Then she drew it out, combed it on a towel, and wound the damp strands around copper tubes so they would take a gentle memory of curve. After that came the loom. It was not large, the one in the apartment, but to Tova it seemed as serious as an organ. Cherrywood uprights, brass pegs, small weights, a turning disc with holes set in careful numbers, 4 strands for a plain braid, 6 for barleycorn, 8 for chevron, if the hair had strength enough and the maker was not in a hurry. Miss Mirry sat with her shoulders low and her eyes half narrowed, passing strands over and under, never yanking, never forcing the pattern ahead of itself. Tova loved the sound, hair sliding against hair, brass weight kissing wood, the quiet tap of her grandmother's thimble against the table when she paused to count. At noon, they ate tomato soup with crackers and sliced apples dusted in cinnamon. Then Miss Mirry opened her shallow drawers and showed the finished pieces, bracelets with gold knots no larger than peas, watch chains with silver hooks, lockets edged with braided black hair so fine it looked like dark water. Each one had a paper label tied with thread, bearing 2 names in her grandmother's angular script, the person who ordered it, the person remembered. "Do not rush what is meant to keep someone," Miss Mirry said once. She was trimming a loose end from a mourning bracelet made for a farmer's widow in Elizabeth, and the winter light had settled blue on the window glass. Tova did not understand the sentence fully then. She thought it meant only that fine work took time. Later, after enough doors had closed and enough people had decided her story by numbers on a page, she understood that her grandmother had been speaking of more than craft. Some things survived because someone had refused to hurry them. Miss Mirry died in April when Tova was 16. It happened on a morning that had been washed clean by rain. The antique store below the apartment had just opened, and a bell at the door kept ringing while Tova stood beside the bed, holding the edge of a quilt her grandmother had sewn from men's shirts. Lila signed papers in the kitchen with a face made solemn by exhaustion. There were relatives, but not close ones. There were neighbours. There was a minister who had kind hands and mispronounced Morella on the first try. The apartment had to be emptied in 6 days. Tova asked for the loom. She asked for the drawers. She asked for the bundles of horsehair, the old labels, the brass weights, the copper tubes, the notebooks where Miss Mirry had written recipes for cleaning, softening, sealing, finishing. But grief is not always given charge of the sorting. A cousin from Rockford said the antique store owner had already made an offer for the work tables. Someone else said the hair would not keep. Lila, pale and far away, said they could not store everything. By the end of that week, the rooms above the store had been swept clean enough to look as if no patient hand had ever lived there. Tova left with a Bible, a brown photograph sleeve, and one bracelet her grandmother had made from the tail hair of a grey mare named Mercy. It was narrow, almost plain, fastened with a worn silver clasp. Miss Mirry had placed it around Tova's wrist 2 months before she died, and pressed the clasp shut with both thumbs. After Lila remarried, the house changed without ever admitting it had changed. Her new husband, Russell Pike, sold insurance from a low office beside a tyre shop and wore his shirts ironed so stiffly that his elbows seemed to crease before his arms moved. He was not a shouting man. That would have been easier to name. He was a man of thermostats turned down 2 degrees at a time, of receipts slid across tables, of questions asked with a pencil in hand. He had a way of making generosity sound irresponsible and need sound like poor planning. He did not break things. He relocated them. Tova's father's cedar chest was moved from Lila's bedroom to the basement, then from the basement to a storage unit, then from the storage unit to a place nobody mentioned again. Miss Mirry's Bible was once found in a cardboard box marked miscellaneous, beside extension cords and old tax files. The horsehair bracelet, because Tova wore it, remained out of his reach, though his eyes rested on it sometimes as if it were an argument he had not yet decided to make. Russell liked plain surfaces. He liked accounts settled. He liked a house where nobody kept sorrow in visible places. When Tova won a scholarship to a small liberal arts college outside Cedar Rapids, Lila cried into a dish towel and Russell said it was good, very good, provided she understood what maintaining it required. Tova understood. She took 18 credits, worked in the library basement repairing book spines, and sent her mother photographs of campus trees in October when they turned the color of copper pots. She called on Sundays. She came home when Lila's blood work changed. Then again when the doctor used the word aggressive and placed both hands flat on his desk. The semester unraveled by inches. First, Tova missed a lab to drive her mother to Iowa City, then a quiz, then 3 days when Lila could not keep food down and Russell had a conference in Peoria he said could not be moved. Tova studied in waiting rooms under fluorescent light, memorizing terms she forgot before dawn. She wrote essays beside infusion chairs. She turned in assignments late with apologies too careful to sound like excuses. Her GPA dropped below the scholarship line in March. The committee letter arrived in an email first, then on paper 3 days later, because institutions like Sorrow to have copies. It said the decision was final after review. It said policies must be applied consistently. It said she could appeal after 1 full academic year of restored performance, which was a clean sentence written by someone who had never tried to restore anything while packing a dorm room with nowhere to go. The same afternoon, student housing notified her that scholarship-linked residency ended at 5 o'clock. Tova returned to her room and placed her books into grocery sacks because boxes cost money at the campus mailroom. Her roommate stood by the window pretending not to watch. Outside, the quad looked newly green, almost tender, and students crossed it carrying iced coffee and rolled posters, moving through weather that had not been altered by one girl's eviction. Russell arrived in his beige sedan just before dusk. He did not come upstairs. He waited by the curb with the engine running while Tova carried down the sacks herself. Leela sat in the passenger seat wearing a scarf over her hair and sunglasses though the sun had gone behind the science building. Her hands were folded around a paper napkin. Tova could see the blue veins at her wrists through the glass. The physical object that broke the day was not a suitcase or a letter, it was a lamp. A cheap white desk lamp, the kind sold in back-to-school bins, with a bendable neck and a plastic shade browned near the bulb. Tova had used it through every night of studying, every online lecture, every hospital discharge form she had read twice before signing as witness. She carried it against her chest like something alive, because both hands were full and the cord trailed behind her. Russell looked at the lamp, then at the crowded back seat and opened the trunk only halfway. "There is no room for sentimental garbage today." 8 words. The lamp slipped from Tova's hand and struck the curb. The shade cracked first, then the bulb gave a soft, final pop. Nobody moved for a moment. Lila turned her face toward the side window, her sunglasses reflecting the brick dormitory and the pale shape of her daughter standing outside it. She did not speak. She did not open the door. Her silence had no cruelty in it, and that made it worse. It was the silence of someone who had spent every last coin of resistance elsewhere. Tova bent, gathered the cord and placed the broken lamp beside a trash can. She kept the Bible, she kept the bracelet, she kept $3 from the photograph sleeve, because the rest had gone to gas, aspirin and vending machine soup in hospital corridors. When Russell said she could stay at the house for 2 weeks if she followed certain conditions, Tova nodded. When the 2 weeks became 3 days because Lila needed calm and Russell needed order, Tova packed before breakfast and left without waking anyone. 6 weeks can be a country of its own. Tova crossed it without a map. She slept first in Cedar Rapids, in the back row of an all-night laundromat where dryers turned with a heavy breathing sound, and the attendant let her stay because she folded abandoned towels into a neat stack. Then Iowa City under the stone overhang of a university art building, where students passed late with laughing voices and the campus sprinklers came on at 4 in the morning. Then Davenport in a bus station chair molded to reject the human body, where she learned to loop her backpack strap around her ankle before closing her eyes. Her money became numbers on receipts until the numbers became memory. $3 went down to $2.37 after a gas station banana and a cup of coffee. She stretched across half a day. Then $1.12 after a public bus fare paid in coins warmed in her fist. Then 64 cents after she bought a packet of crackers from a machine that kept 2 of her nickels. She began saving sugar packets, then salt, then napkins. Hunger did not arrive as drama. It narrowed the world. It made every bakery window too bright. In Moline, she slept behind a church education wing beneath a lilac bush that had just started to leaf. The pastor found her there at 7 in the morning and did not ask for a story. He brought a paper cup of milk, 2 boiled eggs, and a plastic bag with travel soap inside. In Rock Island, a librarian let her keep her backpack under the reference desk after a man near the magazines watched it too closely. In Savannah, a waitress with tired feet wrapped half a meatloaf sandwich in foil and said only that it had been made wrong. Tova wrote their names where she could. Pastor Joel Moline, Mrs. Annika Bell, Rock Island Library, waitress with red shoes, Savannah, name tag missing. She wrote because Miss Miri had taught her that names mattered, especially for the dead, but also for the living who performed some small, honest act and then went on with their day. A name kept the kindness from becoming weather. It made it exact. At night, when she could not sleep, she touched the bracelet and counted the pattern by feel. Over, under, over, turn, over, under, over. The silver clasp had worn a crescent into the inside of her wrist. Sometimes she dreamed of her grandmother's apartment and woke with the scent of beeswax so clear she turned her head expecting to see the loom. By the 6th week she had reached Galena because the river road seemed to be pulling her north and because she had run out of strength to choose any other direction. The town rose in brick terraces above the Galena River, with steep streets and iron balconies and storefronts that looked preserved by a careful hand. Tourists walked slowly there reading plaques. Tova walked slower because her shoes had thinned at the heels and one blister had opened under her left toe. The public library stood in an old building of pale stone, with tall windows and a quiet that felt tended rather than enforced. She went inside for warmth first, then for a chair, then for water from the fountain near the restrooms. The librarian at the front desk, a woman with white hair cut straight at her jaw, looked at Tova's backpack, her coat, her careful posture, and said nothing except that the local newspapers were on the lower shelf by the genealogy room. Tova sat there for an hour before she noticed the classified section. It was in a weekly county paper, folded twice, with notices for estate auctions, hay, pasture fencing, a used snowblower, piano lessons, and 2 lines boxed in black near the bottom of the page. County disposal sale. Abandoned commercial structure, former Horsehair jewelry studio, North Township line. Minimum bid $3. Buyer assumes all liability, removal, taxes and conditions. At first, she read it as one reads a word in a language almost forgotten: horsehair, jewelry, studio. The letters did not move, the room did. Tova placed one finger on the notice and held it there. The paper was thin and slightly gritty beneath her skin. Former Horsehair jewelry studio, not antique store, not craft shed, not vacant shop. The exact words had survived into a county classified, small and cold and nearly missed. She looked toward the window, where afternoon light lay across the table in a long pale rectangle, and for the first time in weeks she felt not hope, which would have been too large, but recognition. There are moments when a life does not open like a door. It clicks like a clasp. She asked the librarian if old county notices could be verified. The woman directed her to a public computer and, after a pause, brought over a scrap of paper with the clerk's office address written on it. Tova checked the county site with hands that had begun to tremble from hunger and something nearer to fear. The sale was real, the structure was real, the minimum bid had received no offers. The final disposal deadline was Monday at noon. It was Friday. She had 64 cents in her pocket, the bracelet on her wrist, and $3 still folded inside the photograph sleeve, because she had refused to break that last small relic of her grandmother's keeping. She took the Bible from her backpack and opened it under the table, not to pray exactly, but to remove the bills. They were soft from years of being pressed between paper and cardboard. 3 $1 bills, each creased differently, each smelling faintly of dust and cedar. The bus to the county office would have cost more than she possessed. So she decided to walk, not because she was brave, not because she believed the notice had been placed for her. She decided because there are times when the next right action is so narrow that it becomes almost merciful. A road, a name on a public building, $3, a craft. Nobody remembered correctly. A bracelet made by hands that had once known every strand by its willingness. Tova folded the newspaper notice into the Bible, returned the photograph sleeve to its place, and stood from the library table slowly so the chair would not scrape. Outside, the evening had turned cold enough to make the brick storefronts hold their colour deep and red, and the hills beyond town were already gathering shadow. She tightened the strap of her backpack, touched the horsehair bracelet once with 2 fingers, and started toward the county clerk's office with the last money she had. By noon on Monday, the forgotten studio would have an owner, or it would have a demolition date. The sidewalk ended before the town did. Beyond the last brick storefront, the pavement gave way to a county shoulder where winter gravel lay in pale ridges beside the road, and she walked there with the newspaper notice folded inside the Bible, and the Bible held flat against her ribs beneath her coat. The afternoon had a sharpened edge. It was not snowing, but the air had the careful stillness that comes before weather, when every tree seems to be listening for its own branches. She did not reach the county clerk's office that first evening. The map on the library computer had made the distance look honest, but maps did not account for hunger, worn shoes, or hills that rose as if the land itself were folding its arms. By dark she had followed signs north and east until the river road had thinned behind her. A farmer in a green pickup slowed once, looked at her through his side window and drove on. She did not blame him. A young woman walking alone with a backpack at dusk belonged to too many possible stories, and most people had learnt to protect themselves from having to choose one. At 7:10, the temperature on the bank sign outside a closed credit union read 31 degrees. By 8:30 it had fallen to 28. She found the hay barn because of the smell before she saw the shape of it. Cut grass, dust, old boards, the dry animal warmth that survives in a barn long after livestock have gone. It stood back from the road behind a sagging wire gate, its roof patched with sheets of dull tin and its sliding door open wide enough for a person to pass sideways. She stood at the entrance and called once, not loudly because she was not sure whether she hoped anyone would answer. No one did. Inside, the darkness was thick but not hostile. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Hay bales were stacked along the left wall, and a rusted cultivator rested in the centre aisle like some patient iron creature that had settled there and forgotten its purpose. She climbed behind the bales where the wind could not reach her directly, pulled 2 loose flakes down from the stack, and made a narrow place between them. The hay pricked through her coat. Mice moved somewhere above in a dry whisper. She slept in pieces. 10 minutes, then 30, then an hour, broken by cold ankles and the need to shift her shoulders away from a knot in the plank floor. In the deepest part of the night she woke to the sound of coyotes in the distance, their voices rising and falling beyond the fields. She held her wrist near her mouth and breathed through the braided hair, not for comfort exactly, but because it gave her something fixed to do. By morning the barn door had turned grey around its edges. Frost lay along the metal teeth of the cultivator and made every cobweb visible. Her fingers were stiff enough that she had to warm them beneath her arms before she could lace her shoes. The blister on her left foot had sealed to her sock during the night. She worked the cloth loose carefully, jaw tight, then tied the shoe with a double knot because stopping later would cost more than the pain. The county road carried her through fields with low stone walls, then past scattered houses whose mailboxes wore the names of families that had likely been there longer than the highway signs. A dog barked from behind a white fence. A school bus passed going the other direction, its windows filled with the small round faces of children wrapped in winter hats. One boy lifted a hand, she lifted hers back. It was nearly 10 when Galena gathered itself again around the hills. The town appeared not all at once but by layers, first the church steeple above bare branches, then a row of limestone foundations, then brick storefronts with painted signs and windows arranged for people who had come to browse rather than survive. A bakery stood at the corner, its glass fogged faintly from inside, and the smell of yeast and cinnamon reached the sidewalk with almost indecent tenderness. Beside it was a hardware store with a narrow green awning. Across the street, a pharmacy displayed greeting cards and reading glasses in a turning rack near the door. Farther down, a cafe had a chalkboard sign promising soup, biscuits and pie, though the words belonged to another kind of day. There was also a dry goods shop with quilts in the window, folded by colour from cream to rust to deep blue. She noticed each business because noticing cost nothing. She did not enter any of them. The county clerk's office occupied the first floor of a courthouse annex built of limestone blocks, practical and square, with a flag snapping in the wind and brass letters darkened by years of hands and weather. The door was heavier than it looked. When she pulled it open, heated air came out, smelling of paper, floor wax and damp wool. Inside, the lobby held 2 benches, a bulletin board, a rack of tax forms, and a clock that clicked with public authority. A man in a Carhartt jacket stood at the recorder's window discussing acreage. An elderly woman sat on the bench with a cane across her knees, reading from a folder through large amber glasses. Somewhere behind the counter, a printer began its patient mechanical complaint. Tova stepped onto the mat and wiped both shoes twice. The clerk's window was framed in oak, with a half-moon opening at the bottom for papers to pass through. Behind it sat a woman near 60, narrow-shouldered and upright, with iron-grey hair twisted into a low coil and held by 2 black pins. Her glasses hung from a chain of small brass beads, and a blue cardigan was buttoned over a white blouse that had been pressed sharply at the collar. On her desk sat a nameplate polished brighter along the top edge, as if her thumb had rested there for years. Margaret E. Hollis, County Clerk. She looked up without smiling, though her face was not unkind. Yes? Tova took the folded classified notice from the Bible and smoothed it once on the counter. I came about the disposal sale. The clerk's eyes lowered to the paper. She did not touch it yet. Which parcel? The former Horsehair Jewellery Studio, North Township Line. At that, something very slight moved across the woman's face. Not surprise. More like a drawer opening in a room she had forgotten she still owned. She reached for a ledger, turned 2 pages, then 1 more, and ran a finger down a column. You have identification. Tova handed over her student ID because it was what she had. The clerk looked at it, then at her, then at the card again. She did not mention that the card belonged to a place that had already let her go. Instead, she typed slowly, every key struck with deliberate accuracy. You are here before the deadline, Mrs. Hollis said. Yes, ma'am. You have inspected the property? No, ma'am. The clerk stopped typing. The man at the recorder's window laughed softly at something said behind the glass. The printer ended its complaint with a final click. In the pause that followed, Mrs. Hollis removed her glasses and laid them beside the keyboard. You understand this is not a residential sale. Yes, ma'am. You understand the structure has no certificate of occupancy. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no active water service. Yes, ma'am. No inspected electric. Yes, ma'am. No heat that this office can certify. Yes, ma'am. The clerk folded her hands on the desk. You understand the county is not selling you a cottage. It is disposing of a liability. Tova kept her palms flat on her side of the counter so they would not curl into fists from cold or weakness. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Hollis watched her through the opening in the glass. Her eyes were grey, not blue, with a darker ring at the edge of each iris. You understand that once the deed is recorded, all obligations move to the purchaser. Taxes, repair, injury, removal, if ordered, all of it. Yes, ma'am. If you walk in and the floor fails, that is yours. Yes, ma'am. If the roof collapses after closing, that is yours. Yes, ma'am. If the demolition order proceeds because you fail to stabilize the property, that is yours too. Tova swallowed. Yes, ma'am. The clerk leaned back a little, enough for the chair to make a dry sound beneath her. And you have funds for the minimum bid? Tova opened the Bible to the photograph sleeve. It would have been easier if the bills had been crisp. They would have looked official, purposeful, less like something kept through grief. But they were soft and creased and thin at the corners. 3 tired pieces of paper that had been carried too close to old family things. She slid them through the half-moon, opening one at a time. Mrs. Hollis looked at the bills, then at the Bible, then at the bracelet on Tova's wrist. You know what horsehair work is, she said. It was not a question, but Tova answered anyway. My grandmother made it. What was her name? The room became more exact. Tova said it quietly. Mrs. Hollis did not move for a moment. Then she lowered her eyes to the ledger and closed it without marking the page. The elderly woman on the bench turned a paper in her folder outside. A truck went by, its tires hissing on damp pavement. Mirella, the clerk said, and this time she did not read the name. Miss Miri Mercer. Tova felt the bracelet against her skin as though it had tightened. You knew her? My mother did. Mrs. Hollis reached for her glasses but did not put them on. My mother had a watch chain repaired by her in 1966. Black horsehair, silver hook, barleycorn pattern. She wore it on Sundays long after the watch quit keeping time. A small silence settled between them, not empty, but furnished. The clerk looked again at the worn bills on the counter. Miss Miri used to come in here when I was a girl, though this office was across the hall then. She had a way of making people lower their voices without asking them to. Tova did not trust herself with a long sentence. Yes. Mrs. Hollis drew the bills toward her, squared them carefully, and placed them beneath a paperweight shaped like the county courthouse. Then she opened a drawer and removed a packet clipped with a brass fastener. The county seal was printed on the top sheet in blue ink. There were blanks filled already by typewriter, and other blanks waiting for a hand. I am required to read the conditions, she said, and her voice had returned to its formal register. I will do that now. She read slowly, not because Tova could not understand, but because the county had trained its servants to build walls out of sentences: parcel designation, prior use, vacant status, known deficiencies, no warranties expressed or implied. Buyer assumes full responsibility. Buyer accepts all present and future risk. Buyer has 7 calendar days to secure entry points and 30 days to submit a stabilization plan, or demolition order may proceed. The words passed through the room like cold water. When the reading ended, Mrs. Hollis slid the first page under the glass with a black pen. Sign exactly as your identification reads. Tova signed. Her handwriting looked thinner than usual, but it held together. She signed the second page, then the third. On the fourth, her hand paused because the line said purchaser, and the words seemed to have wandered into the wrong life. Mrs. Hollis did not hurry her. She waited with both hands folded, a woman trained by years of records to understand that some names took longer to write than others. After the final signature, the clerk gathered the pages and aligned them by tapping their bottom edges against the desk. Then she reached to her left for a heavy brass stamp mounted on a black base. The sound of it coming down was not loud. It was exact. Embossed paper lifted beneath her hand, marked with the county seal. Mrs. Hollis turned the page, stamped again, then signed in a practiced script that began narrow and ended with a strong crossing line. She entered something into the computer, waited for the printer, attached a receipt, and folded a copy into a long envelope. Then she took one of the 3 bills from beneath the paperweight. For a moment Tova thought the clerk had found some additional fee, some tax or recording charge hidden in the process, and the floor seemed to tilt under her tired body. But Mrs. Hollis did not put the bill in the register. She opened the center drawer of her desk and laid it flat inside, beneath a ruler and beside a tin of paper clips. The county requires proof of consideration, she said. The receipt shows full payment. The drawer will remember the rest well enough. Tova stared at her. Mrs. Hollis placed the remaining 2 bills in the cash tray and closed it with a modest click. Do not make me explain kindness as a bookkeeping error. The sentence was dry enough to be official. It was also mercy. The clerk wrote directions on the back of a duplicate form in square, careful letters. She named the road, the turn, the slope, the line of walnut trees, the culvert before the property. She drew a small arrow where the lane narrowed and added, "Do not cross the north side after rain. Ground sinks there." Then she hesitated and wrote one more note near the bottom. "Bring a pry bar before using the back door. You will take Bench Street out of town until it meets North Council Hill Road," she said. "Follow that past the old cemetery rise. The lane has not been maintained properly. There is a cattle gate, but the chain should be looped, not locked. If it is locked, you come back here before cutting anything. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Hollis passed the envelope through the glass, then a single iron key on a paper tag yellowed at the edges. The tag bore a number and the words "front only." "This may not work." Tova closed her fingers around the key. It was colder than the room. "Thank you." The clerk looked as if she might answer in the ordinary way, then chose something else. "Your grandmother once told my mother that hair remembers the hand that cared for it. I thought that was foolish when I was young." Tova waited. "I do not think so now." Outside the annex, the wind had shifted west. She stood on the courthouse steps with the envelope under one arm and the key held in her closed hand until the ridged metal warmed slightly. The businesses along the street had opened fully by then. The bakery door swung wide for a woman carrying 2 paper bags. The hardware store owner arranged snow shovels in a barrel, though the sky had not yet decided. The pharmacy sign hummed faintly. A man in a tan coat crossed toward the cafe, and the bell above its door rang twice as he entered. In the dry goods window, the quilts remained folded in their ordered colors. The town went on being itself. Tova turned toward Bench Street. Galena was a place of slopes. Streets rose sharply from the river and then rose again, as though each generation had built a little farther up to keep watch over the last. She walked past brick houses with iron fences, limestone steps worn hollow at the center, and porches held by turned posts painted cream, green or faded blue. A delivery driver wheeled crates into the back of a restaurant. 2 women paused outside a shop window, each holding a coffee cup with both hands. Neither looked at her in a way that stayed. Past the cemetery rise, town thinned into country by degrees. The road narrowed, then lost its curb. A pair of horses stood in a field chewing from the same hay ring, their winter coats rough and dull. One lifted its head as she passed, dark ears forward, and Tova stopped long enough to lower her eyes and greet it without sound. Near a white farmhouse, a brown dog came to the end of its chain and barked 3 times with grave professional attention. Then, having announced her existence to the county, sat down and watched her go. Walnut trees began appearing after the next bend. They stood along the road at irregular intervals, their branches bare and black against the afternoon sky, each one holding last year's husks in the grass beneath it. The ground smelled damp there, less like snow and more like leaves returning to themselves. A creek ran somewhere out of sight, fast enough to make a cold silver noise through the brush. She passed a neighbor's place with a green mailbox shaped like a barn. Smoke rose from its chimney in a steady line. An older man splitting kindling in the yard paused with the hatchet in one hand and looked toward her, then toward the road ahead. He gave the smallest nod. Not greeting exactly, but acknowledgement. She returned it. The motion cost almost nothing and somehow steadied her. The lane to the property announced itself poorly. A rusted cattle gate hung between 2 limestone posts, almost swallowed by wild grapevine. The chain was indeed looped, not locked, and the metal rasped against itself when she lifted it. Beyond the gate, the lane ran between walnut trees toward a low rise, 2 ruts filled with old leaves and rainwater. She closed the gate behind her because Mrs. Hollis had drawn the loop carefully on the directions, and careful instructions deserved obedience. The walk from the gate to the building was longer than it first appeared. At one point the ground dipped near the culvert, and water moved beneath flat stones with a hollow chuckle. The north side was soft as warned. Her right shoe sank half an inch, and she stepped back onto the center rut, breath showing faintly before her face. Thorn canes caught her coat. A crow called once from the tree line, and then thought better of continuing. The studio sat beyond the rise, turned slightly away from the road as if it had grown tired of being seen. It was narrower than a house and deeper than a shop, built on a low limestone foundation with white clapboard walls gone grey where paint had released them. The front measured perhaps 22 feet across, with a simple gable roof whose cedar shingles had darkened almost to black. A brick chimney rose at the east end, missing 2 courses near the top. The front door was panelled, once green, now the colour of lichen and weather. On either side of it were tall windows, 6 panes over 6, their glass wavy and dim. Above the door hung a sign so faded she had to stand nearly beneath it to read the ghost of its lettering. Voss Horsehair Works. Braids, chains, memorial pieces. The paint had peeled from the word memorial until only M, R, and a faint final S remained. There was a rear L attached by a lower roof, likely the workroom with a narrow chimney pipe that had collapsed halfway down its own bracket. The whole structure leaned not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the weary honesty of a body that had held itself upright longer than expected. One front shutter hung by a single hinge. The threshold had lifted at one corner. A swallow nest, empty and dry, clung beneath the eave. She stood there long enough for cold to pass through the soles of her shoes. Nothing about the building welcomed her in the manner of stories. No warm light, no hidden music, no sign from the dead. It waited behind its broken paint and blind windows, and waiting was not the same as inviting. A person could mistake one for the other and be harmed by it. Tova took out the iron key. The front lock resisted. She tried once, then stopped, remembering her grandmother's hands at the loom and the way force ruined what patience could solve. She pulled the key back slightly, lifted the door with her shoulder just enough to ease pressure from the latch, and turned again. This time the lock gave. The door opened inward 6 inches and caught against warped flooring. A smell came out first: dust, old wood, mouse droppings, rain-soaked plaster, and beneath all of it a faint dry sweetness like hay stored in a cedar box. She pushed with her hip, the door scraped forward another foot. Light entered behind her in a grey panel and laid itself across the floorboards, revealing a scatter of leaves, a dead beetle, and the pale trail where something small had dragged nesting material under the baseboard. She stepped inside. The front room had once been for receiving customers. She could see that even through neglect. A narrow counter ran along the right wall, its surface scarred by ink rings and blade marks. Behind it were shallow shelves, some empty, some holding little cardboard boxes softened by damp. A glass display case stood near the left window, cracked across one corner but still upright. Inside lay tarnished hooks, a velvet pad gone brown, and 3 paper tags tied to nothing. The ceiling was low enough to make the room feel held. Plaster had fallen near the west wall, exposing lath-like ribs. A black stove sat in the corner on a square of slate, its pipe disconnected and angled toward the floor. Near the door, someone had left a chair with a cane seat broken through the middle. On the wall above the counter, a calendar from 1978 remained open to November, the picture showing a red barn in snow that had outlived the year it described. Tova listened. Buildings speak before they can be trusted. This one clicked as it cooled. It shifted somewhere overhead. Water dripped in the back, slow enough to count. 1 drop, then another, then silence enough to hold the next. She crossed the front room carefully, placing each foot near the wall where floorboards were more likely to rest above joists. The air stirred around her coat. Dust lifted and made the light visible. When she reached the doorway to the rear L, she paused with one hand against the frame. The back room was the true room. It ran nearly the length of the building, with work tables under the south windows where the best light would have fallen in winter. The windows were dirty but generous, and even on that grey afternoon they made the room brighter than it had any right to be. Along the far wall stood cabinets with dozens of shallow drawers, each fitted with a small brass pull and a paper label holder. Some labels remained, their ink browned but legible in places. Bay, black, white, silver, mixed, long, short, washed, unsorted. On the central table sat 3 braiding looms. The first 2 were compact, cherrywood darkened by hand oil, their pegs still arranged in circles and their brass weights hanging like muted bells. The largest stood behind them, nearly 3 feet high, its uprights thicker, its base broader, its turning disc fixed with 16 holes. Dust lay across it, but not evenly. The places where hands had once rested seemed to hold a different sheen, as though use had sunk below the surface and refused to leave. Tova did not touch it. Not yet. There were hundreds of bundles of horsehair in the cabinets and boxes, some wrapped in tissue, some bound with thread, some loose where mice had disturbed them. The colours ranged from coal black to cream, from chestnut red to silver grey. A few bundles still held labels with names. Daisy Mare, 1899. Colonel Gelding Bay, sable black for Mrs. Henning. Other drawers held half-finished bracelets pinned to cards, copper tubes, old thermometers, silver clasps wrapped in paper, and one shallow tray of gold knots no larger than seeds. The room had not died all at once. It had been interrupted. That was the first clear thing she understood. Whoever last worked here had not cleared the table, not packed the drawers, not closed the trade with ceremony. A braid lay half-turned on one loom, 8 strands still separated by their weights. The pattern paused at the moment before crossing. A pair of scissors rested open beside it. There was a cup on the windowsill, dry and stained at the bottom. On the chair back hung an apron, stiff with age. The sight of the unfinished braid made her sit down. The chair complained beneath her but held. For several minutes she did nothing but look at the suspended strands. She had seen abandonment before, dorm rooms emptied under deadline, hospital chairs after visitors had gone, houses where certain names were no longer said, but this was different. This was work stopped mid-breath, care left in place because someone had intended to return. Late afternoon lowered itself outside. She made herself inspect the rest before dark. A narrow side room held a cracked wash basin, a pump handle that did not move, and shelves with jars of cloudy liquid sealed by waxed cloth. A closet near the front contained broom handles, a coil of rope, and newspapers stacked against a draft. The back door would not open at all, which explained the clerk's warning. A corner of the roof had leaked into a tin washpan long enough to stain it orange. There was no bed, no stovepipe fit for use, no food except what remained of the boiled egg from Moline, wrapped in a napkin at the bottom of her bag. She ate half of it standing by the south window, because sitting too long made her body believe the day had ended. The egg had gone rubbery, and a bit of shell remained under her thumb. She saved the other half for morning out of habit rather than plan. Before full dark she chose a place to sleep in the front room near the inner wall, away from the worst draughts and not directly beneath the stained ceiling. She swept the floor with a broom that lost bristles at every stroke, pushing leaves and mouse leavings toward the door. From the back room she brought the apron and shook it outside until dust rose around her like breath. Then she folded it twice and placed it beneath her head, because it was cloth, and cloth was something. The building cooled quickly after sunset. Boards tightened, nails ticked. Somewhere inside the wall a mouse resumed its honest work. The windows turned black, and with the blackness came the reflection of the room around her, the counter, the broken chair, her own shape on the floor, thin beneath her coat. She pulled the Bible against her chest, tucked the envelope from the clerk inside it, and closed both arms around the book. Through the front windows she could see a narrow piece of sky between walnut branches. No streetlight reached the property. No passing car sent its beams through the glass. The dark outside was complete in a way she had nearly forgotten existed. It frightened her at first, then slowly became less like absence and more like a blanket too heavy to lift. She listened to the house. Not for danger only, though. She listened for that too. She listened for the kind of settling that meant collapse, for water gathering, for animals larger than mice. But after a while, beneath those practical concerns, she began to hear smaller things. The stovepipe's faint tap, the window sash moving in the wind, the soft occasional fall of dust from plaster to floor, a loosened shutter knocking once, waiting, knocking again. She had slept in public places for weeks, shaping her rest around strangers. This was different. The room was cold, the floor was hard, nothing had been made safe yet. Still no one would tell her to move along. No one would ask what she was doing there. No one would look at her backpack and decide what kind of person she had become. Near midnight rain began. It found the roof's 3 patient places and entered with a rhythm the house seemed to know well. One drip into the washpan, one onto the floor near the west wall, one somewhere in the back room, landing with a darker sound, perhaps on wood, perhaps on an old cardboard box. She counted them until they separated into their own measures. At some hour beyond counting, she rose, took the tin washpan from the leaking corner, and shifted it 3 inches to catch the steadier fall. Then she stood in the doorway to the back room and looked toward the looms. The largest one was only a shape now, black against the greyness of the windows. Its uprights rose like two narrow shoulders. The hanging weights did not move, yet she had the strange impression that the room had been holding its breath around them for a very long time. She returned to the front room and lay down again. Her coat smelled of hay, courthouse heat, and rain. Her wrist ached where the bracelet clasp pressed against the floor. She slid one finger under it to ease the pressure and felt the braided strands, still firm after all those years, each crossing held in place by a patience older than her trouble. The house had been waiting, and so had she. Morning entered through the cracked panes without warmth. The rain had stopped before dawn, leaving the yard dark with soaked leaves and the lane shining in the ruts. Tova woke because a drop from the ceiling had missed the washpan and landed on the back of her hand. For a few seconds she did not know where she was. The low ceiling above her looked like a page browned by age. Then the smell of damp plaster and horsehair found her, and the night arranged itself behind her in patient order. She sat up slowly. Her back had taken the shape of the floorboards and did not want to return from it. Her left foot throbbed inside its shoe. The half-egg from the day before waited in its napkin, and she ate it in 2 careful bites, standing by the front window where weak light touched the counter. Outside, a squirrel worked along the walnut branches with the deliberate attention of a creature whose whole life depended on remembering where it had hidden things. There was no water inside the studio. The pump handle in the washroom remained frozen in place. Though frozen was not the right word, it had not moved for years, and its refusal felt older than weather. Behind the building, beyond the back L and the fallen pipe, she found the well beneath a round wooden cover grey with rot. The handle of the iron pump beside it moved halfway down, stuck, then gave a dry cough when she tried again. Rust dust fell from the joint, no water came. She went to the creek. It ran beyond the walnut trees, narrow but quick, carrying meltwater over limestone and dark roots. The bank was slick, and she knelt with one knee in leaves, filling 2 jars she had found on a shelf after rinsing them as well as she could with yesterday's rainwater. She did not drink from the creek without boiling. Miss Miri had been precise about such things, and precision kept people alive as often as it kept a braid straight. The outhouse stood north of the studio, half hidden by sumac and wild grapevine. It leaned with private dignity, its crescent moon cut out, warped but visible. The door had swollen shut at the bottom. Tova pulled vines free, found a flat stone, and used it as a wedge until the door opened enough for her to inspect the floor. 2 boards were soft. One had failed near the back corner. She placed her weight only along the threshold and decided without ceremony that the safest thing in the world could still be unpleasant. The first day became a list made in pencil on the back of the classified notice. Water fire, roof leaks, door, food, chimney floor. She wrote the words as though naming them reduced them. It did not. Still, the list gave the morning a spine. She moved through the building inch by inch, learning where the front room floor complained and where it answered firmly. Near the west wall, the boards dipped. Near the counter, they were sound in the back room. The centre path between the work tables held better than the corners. The largest loom stood on a broad table positioned over 2 joists, which may have been luck or old knowledge. By noon, she had learned 6 creaks. The high creak near the front door meant warped boards only. The deeper one beside the display case meant stop. The click near the stove was a loose nail. The soft sigh in the back room came from a plank that bowed but returned. The pop under the 3rd work table was mice moving below, not wood failing. The worst sound was not a creak at all, but a damp crush near the washroom wall, where she would not step again. On the 2nd day she found more containers. A lard tin, 2 glass jars, a chipped pitcher, a copper basin green along one seam. She set them beneath the 3 leaks and marked their positions with chalk from a drawer. She cleaned the front door threshold with a broken knife so it would open fully, then carried leaves out in her arms. The air inside changed by small degrees. Not fresh, not yet, but less trapped. On the 3rd day, hunger made her practical. She had nothing left to eat but 3 sugar packets from her coat pocket and a single cracker wrapped in tissue. She dissolved the sugar in boiled creek water over a little fire made outside between stones, because the chimney could not be trusted. The drink tasted faintly of smoke and metal. She told herself it was broth, and the lie was too thin to harm anyone. By afternoon, she walked back toward town. The road felt longer in daylight. Every rise took breath from her. At the green mailbox shaped like a barn, the dog came out again and barked once, then recognized her poverty of threat and settled for following her with its eyes. The man splitting kindling was not in the yard. Smoke lifted from his chimney, straight and pale. The hardware store with the narrow green awning had a bell above the door that sounded tired but faithful. Inside, the place was warmer than the street and smelled of mineral spirits, seed packets, rope, machine oil, and coffee gone thick on a hot plate. Nails were kept in wooden drawers with brass labels. Coils of sash cord hung from pegs. A rack of handsaws stood near the back like thin silver fish. Along one wall were stovepipes, firebrick, shovels, pipe brushes, roofing felt, and cans of putty. The floorboards had been darkened by boots for so many years that their grain seemed almost black. Behind the counter stood a man with one cloudy eye and one sharp brown one, wearing a red wool shirt under denim overalls. His beard was trimmed close, white at the chin and yellowed faintly near the mouth from coffee or time. He had large hands, but he used them quietly, turning the page of a catalogue with one finger before looking up. "Help you find something?" Tova stood near a barrel of kindling bundles and tried to arrange her request into words that would not reveal all of her. "I bought the old Horsehair studio." The man's good eye held her. "Did you?" "Yes, sir." "You related to the woman who worked there?" "My grandmother learned the trade. Different shop." He nodded once, as if this answer neither satisfied nor displeased him. "Name's Amos Rusk. Tova Mercer." "I know where it is." He set the catalogue aside. "I also know what it is." She looked down at her hands because looking at his face made the next sentence harder. "I need to make it safe enough to stay in. I don't have money today. I can work or repay after I find work." Amos Rusk reached under the counter and drew out a stool, not for himself but for her. He set it beside the nail drawers with a thud. "Sit before you fall over." "I'm all right." "No, you're upright. Different condition." The stool was close enough that refusing would have become pride rather than dignity. She sat. The hardware store seemed to move farther away for a moment, then return. Amos took a brown paper bag from behind the counter and placed it near her knee. "My wife packs too much." Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper and an apple with a soft place near the stem. Tova looked at the bag but did not reach for it. "I can pay later." "You can listen now." She nodded. He leaned both forearms on the counter. "That building needs a roof before it needs beauty, needs a chimney before it needs heat, needs floor patches before it needs furniture. You touch electrical before somebody licensed looks, and you deserve the sparks you get." "Yes, sir." "You got tools?" "No, sir." "Any account?" "No." "Any people?" The question entered too cleanly. Tova answered after a breath. "Not here." Amos turned, pulled a green ledger from a shelf, opened it to a blank page, and wrote her name at the top with a carpenter's pencil. "I keep local accounts. I do not have credit." "I did not say bank credit," he wrote the date. "I said account." She shook her head. "I cannot promise fast payment." "Good. Fast promises spoil quicker." He tapped the pencil once against the page. "You will buy only what keeps you alive and keeps the county from tearing that place down. No paint, no curtains, no foolishness. You bring receipts from any work you do for pay. You pay in pieces. I can clean, stack, sweep, inventory. Likely you can." He reached beneath the counter again and brought out a paperback book with a cracked spine and a blue cover faded almost white. Home Repair for Rural Properties, 1971. Somebody had written Rusk in black marker across the top. "Take this." "I should not." "You should read it twice before you climb anything." The book opened naturally to a chapter on chimneys. The margins held notes in 2 different hands, one firm, one cramped, both practical. Amos began making a list. 1 chimney brush, 6-inch round, used but sound, $4.50. Fiberglass rods, 3 sections, loaned, no charge if returned clean. Leather gloves, split palm, $2. Dust mask, 25 cents. Small pry bar, $1.75. 20 feet of quarter-inch cotton rope, 60 cents. A tin of roofing nails, £1, 58 cents. Tarp, used army surplus, 6x8, $3. Stove cement, 90 cents. Wire brush, 40 cents. Box of kitchen matches, 12 cents. 2 cans of beans, 38 cents each. 1 sack cornmeal, 79 cents. Salt, 10 cents. He said each price aloud as he wrote it, not to shame her but to keep the world honest. The total came to $15.75. Tova stared at the number. Amos drew a line beneath it. Account. I need to work that off. You need to eat 1 biscuit before you try to save a condemned building. She ate because he turned away and began arranging bolts in a drawer with unnecessary concentration. The biscuit was cold and tasted of lard and flour and someone's kitchen. She ate slowly enough not to make herself sick. The apple she put in her coat pocket for later. When she left, the chimney brush and rods were tied together with rope, the supplies bundled in the army tarp, and the paperback manual tucked beneath her arm. Amos stood in the doorway with the bell resting against his shoulder. "Start with the flue," he called. "No fire inside until you know where the smoke wants to go." "Yes, sir. And do not trust old floors after rain." I learned that. Learn it twice. Back at the studio, she began with the chimney because heat was not comfort now. It was survival with an edge. The stovepipe had to be removed first. She spread newspapers on the slate, wrapped her scarf over her nose, and loosened the rusted collar with the small pry bar, inch by stubborn inch. Soot fell immediately, black and soft as ground charcoal. She carried the pipe outside and laid it on stones, then looked up into the flue with a match held at arm's length. The light showed a narrow throat furred thick with creosote. Creosote had a smell unlike ordinary soot. Bitter, tarry, almost medicinal, it clung to the brick in ridges, glossy in places where old fires had cooled wrong. Miss Mary had once said that neglect was simply work postponed until it became dangerous. The chimney proved her right. Tova tied the brush to the first rod, then the second, then the third. The manual said to clean from the top if possible, the roof said otherwise. So she worked from below, kneeling on the slate, pushing the brush upward into the flue until resistance tightened through her shoulders. She twisted clockwise, pulled down, pushed up again. Soot rained onto the newspapers. Creosote flakes struck her sleeves, her hair, the floor, the stovetop. Every 10 minutes she stopped, coughed into the dust mask, and rested her forehead against her wrist. The first hour cleared only the lower throat. The second brought down hard black curls the size of walnut shells. By the third, her arms shook so badly that she had to brace one elbow against the stove. She took the rods apart, cleaned their threads, tied a rag around the brush head, and repeated the process with shorter strokes. The manual's margin note said, "Do not confuse movement with progress. Check, draw." So she checked. She lit one match and held it inside the stove door. The flame trembled toward the flue but did not lean. Not enough. She went back to brush. Late in the day, the obstruction changed. The brush struck something that gave a hollow scrape, then loosened. A mass dropped hard into the stove belly with a sound that made her flinch. She reached in with gloved hands and pulled out a bird's nest blackened at the edges, built of straw, string, twigs, and 3 strands of horsehair so pale they shone even through soot. She held them for a moment. Then she set them on the counter, apart from the waist. By dusk, she had worked 6 hours. Her shoulders were no longer separate parts of her body but one long ache. The newspapers held a mound of creosote and soot high enough to fill half a bucket. She carried it outside in stages and buried it away from the building as the manual advised, because chimney leavings could ignite if treated carelessly. The second match told the truth. When she held it inside the stove door, the flame bent clearly upward, thin and eager. She watched it until it burned near her fingers, then shook it out and sat back on her heels. The first fire was no larger than 2 handfuls of kindling. She built it as if building trust. crumpled newspaper, splinters, 3 dry sticks from beneath the eaves, then 1 thumb-thick piece of fallen walnut she had split with the pry bar badly enough to shame any proper woodsman. The smoke hesitated at first, spilled a little into the room, and made her heart seize. Then the flue caught. The smoke lifted. The stove made one settling click, then another. Heat entered the room like a cautious animal. She did not crowd it. The first hot meal was beans in the chipped pitcher set inside a dented pot with creek water around it. Because she did not yet trust any vessel entirely, she stirred with the handle of a spoon found in a drawer, washed with boiled water and scrubbed with salt. The beans thickened slowly. She added a pinch of cornmeal, then another, and the meal became something between soup and paste. She ate it from the pitcher, wrapped in her coat, sitting on the floor 3 feet from the stove while the room gathered a circle of warmth around her knees. No meal in her life had been quieter. After that, she began the inventory of the workroom. Not because the roof no longer leaked, or the floor no longer threatened, or the county no longer waited with its demolition order folded in some office file. She began because the room deserved to be known before it was repaired. Miss Mirry would have done the same. A maker did not sweep all things into piles and call the work begun. A maker sorted. She used the back of old invoice paper from a drawer and wrote by daylight. Cabinet 1. Horsehair bundles, mostly sorted by colour. Bay, black, chestnut, grey, mixed. Some damaged by mice, several still usable if washed. Paper labels fragile. Cabinet 2. Fasteners, silver hooks, tarnished, gold-filled knots, small brass rings, 2 envelopes marked not suitable for mourning, 1 packet of black silk thread. Cabinet 3. Tools, scissors, 3 pairs, awls, 2, bone comb, cracked, copper tubes, 18, thermometer, mercury, possible, small alcohol lamp, empty, beeswax cakes wrapped in cloth. Cabinet 4. Unfinished work, bracelets pinned to cards, 2 watch chains, 1 necklace with missing clasp, several braid samples labelled chevron, barleycorn, ladder, round 8. On the tables she found more. A wooden gauge marked in inches and fractions, a ledger swollen with damp, its pages stuck together at the edges, a tin of straight pins, a shallow dish holding broken clasp parts, 3 little muslin bags filled with something gritty and white, perhaps polishing compound, a paper envelope containing photographs of horses, each one labelled with a name, a farm, and sometimes a date of death. She did not open everything at once. By the second afternoon of inventory, she understood that the studio had its own order, though age had blurred it. The finest hair had been kept high and dry, coarser practice hair lower, tools near light, finished pieces away from heat, mourning orders separated from ordinary keepsakes. It was not random. It was a mind preserved in placement. The largest loom remained for last. It stood on the central table beneath the best south-facing window, taller and heavier than the others, built from cherrywood that had darkened to a deep red brown. The base was rectangular with rounded corners and a shallow drawer beneath the turning disc. 2 uprights rose from the back corners, connected near the top by a crosspiece. Brass pegs circled the disc in 2 rings. 16 hanging weights, each shaped like a narrow bell, rested against the base, their cords stiff with dust. Tova cleaned around it first. She brushed the table, cleared mouse leavings from the drawer beneath, catalogued the weights, counted the holes. The loom had been built for complex work, likely memorial chains requiring long, even tension. It was too large for ordinary bracelets. Its uprights were thicker than they needed to be, but old tools often carried extra wood because wood was cheaper than failure. On the 3rd pass with the cloth, she heard it. Not a sound in the room, a sound inside the tool. Her knuckle struck the left upright by accident, and instead of the dull note of solid cherrywood, it answered with a softer, deeper tap, hollow. She stopped. The stove in the front room ticked. Wind moved against the south windows. She tapped the upright again, lower this time. Hollow, higher, hollow. She crossed to the right, upright and tapped. There too the sound changed from surface to chamber. The crosspiece gave the same answer for 6 inches, then solid wood beyond. She took the smallest brass weight and used it like a pendulum, touching it gently to different parts of the frame. Solid wood gave a short click. The hidden space gave a rounded knock, low and waiting. The hollow sections seemed to connect, left upright into crosspiece into right upright, like a narrow passage built inside the loom. Weight test came next. She had learned from the manual how to think with leverage. She lifted one of the smaller looms first, judging its weight against size. Then she tried the largest. It should have been heavy. It was heavier, not by a dramatic amount, but by a wrong one, dense in the uprights. Uneven when tipped forward. Something inside shifted so faintly she first believed she had imagined it. She tipped it again. There. A muted slide. Her mouth went dry. She searched the frame without haste because haste breaks old joinery. The uprights had no visible screws, only pegs capped with end grain. The base was pegged too, tight and hand-cut. The crosspiece bore a decorative cedar disc at its centre, no larger than $50, inlaid into the cherrywood. At first it seemed ornamental, a pale circle against the darker frame. Then she saw that the grain of the disc did not align with the grain around it. It was not inlay, it was a plug. She did not pry it with the metal bar. Instead she found the thinnest awl, wrapped its handle in cloth, and worked the point gently around the cedar edge. Dust lifted. The disc did not move. She warmed the wood with her hands, then held it near the stove for several minutes, not close enough to crack it, only enough to loosen whatever old swelling held it in place. Back at the table, she tried again. The disc turned one fraction. She stopped breathing. Another fraction. Then another. At last it came free into her palm, light as a button. Behind it was darkness and the smell of cedar, paper, and old metal. The opening was narrow. She could not reach inside with fingers. She straightened a length of stiff wire from a broken basket handle and bent one end into a hook. The first thing it caught was cloth, not loose cloth, but something wrapped tightly and pushed deep into the hollow crosspiece. She drew it out inch by inch. The package was tied in linen thread browned with age. Its outer wrapping had been waxed once and had held against damp with remarkable stubbornness. She set it on the table and did not open it until she had drawn out the next and the next. There were 6 packages in all from the crosspiece. Then she discovered that the upright chambers held more. She had to remove 2 lower pegs, each one fitted so carefully that only patience and a little warm water loosened them. From the left upright came a roll wrapped in oilcloth, 3 paper packets, and a small chamois bundle tied with blue thread. From the right came a narrow tin box, black with age, and a muslin pouch that clinked softly when set down. The room seemed to gather around the table. Tova lit the stove again, though the day was not yet dark, less for warmth than for steadiness. She washed her hands in boiled creek water, dried them on the least dirty part of the apron, and laid a piece of cotton over the work surface. Then she opened the packages one at a time. The first held tools. Not large tools, but heirloom tools made for a hand that had known exact work. A pair of fine scissors with mother-of-pearl handles, a narrow silver awl, 3 bone gauges marked with tiny measurements, a brass tension hook, a wooden fid polished smooth by years of use. Each piece lay in its own stitched pocket, and beneath them was a note no larger than a calling card, for the one who still has hands for keeping. She read it twice and placed it beside the tools. The second package held raw material of a quality she had never seen even in Miss Mary's drawers. Horsehair sorted into bundles no thicker than candle wicks, black, white, silver, chestnut, and a rare pale gold. Each bundle had been washed, aligned, tied at both ends, and wrapped in tissue. The strands shone when lifted toward the window, not bright, deep, as if light had been combed into them and taught to remain. The third held finished work. 40 pieces. She did not count them all at first. She only uncovered the top layer and sat back from the beauty of it. Bracelets, watch chains, mourning rings, locket borders, 1 long guard chain, several narrow memorial braids fitted with gold and silver findings. Each was tied to a paper label written in brown ink. Names, dates, places. Ordered by Mrs. Abigail Renner for Jacob Renner, died 1871 for Eliza Bell, from the tale of her mare Juniper, 1884. In memory of Samuel T. Ward, Shiloh, 1862, for a child no age written, only beloved. A portable graveyard would have sounded cruel if said aloud, but that was not what it was. Each piece was a hand-held monument, not to death alone, but to the daily fact of having loved someone enough to keep a trace near the pulse. Stones stood in cemeteries for weather to read. These had been made for wrists, collars, waistcoats, watch pockets, and the private drawer beside a bed. They were not grand, they were near. Tova covered them again before tears could fall on the labels. The oilcloth roll held papers, but she did not open them yet. The letter lay there, folded into a packet tied with black ribbon, and the sight of handwriting made her caution sharpen. Some things had to be read with a full morning and a steadier body. She set the roll apart. The chamois bundle contained a military medal. It was a Grand Army of the Republic membership medal. The bronze star darkened with age, the eagle above it still clear, the ribbon fragile and faded. On the back, engraved with an unsteady hand, was the year 1889 and the initials E.V. Tova, knew enough from courthouse plaques and small-town monuments to understand that the Civil War had left its marks in every county, whether visible or carried quietly in drawers. She laid the medal beside the labels and did not polish it. The narrow tin box came last. Its lid resisted, then released with a soft sigh of air that had been trapped through more seasons than any person could count. Inside were envelopes, coin rolls and folded bills, all arranged with an order so careful that the first glance told her this was not forgotten shop money. This had been hidden deliberately, saved deliberately, kept for someone who might never come. She did not touch the money for several minutes. The stove clicked. The window glass trembled faintly in the wind. Her hands rested on either side of the tin, as if it were warm, though it was cold. Then she began. She counted on the cotton cloth, grouping by kind, writing every amount in pencil before moving to the next. There were old paper bills, large-size silver certificates and national banknotes, some brittle at the folds, some preserved in envelopes marked by year. There were rolls of coins wrapped in paper gone soft at the edges, Morgan silver dollars, their Liberty heads worn at the highest points, Barber half-dollars, seated Liberty quarters, Indian head cents in 2 little paper twists, several gold coins wrapped separately in tissue, each one making her breath shorten when it touched the cloth. She counted once, and did not trust it. She counted again. Then a third time, because hunger, cold, and disbelief could each make a person careless. The total came to $27,300.47. The odd cents were mostly Indian head pennies and 2 worn shield nickels, dark as old buttons. She wrote the final number and stared at it until the pencil mark blurred. It was not a fortune in the way magazines used the word. It would not make a person grand, but measured against eviction notices, hunger, roof leaks, and county deadlines, it was a mountain under a cloth. She covered the coins with both hands, not to claim them, to keep them from vanishing. No one came, no music rose. The room did not brighten. The money lay exactly where it had been laid, and the house kept its silence. For a long time, Tova remained seated at the table beneath the south windows. The largest loom stood open before her, its cedar plug resting nearby like a little moon. The hollow uprights had given up what they had kept, but they did not look empty. They looked relieved. She placed the money back in the tin box, not all at once, but by kind. Bills between paper, coins in their rolls, gold in tissue, the medal she wrapped again in chamois, the finished jewellery she covered and set in the shallow drawer away from drafts, the tools she returned to their stitched pockets, the letter packet she left on the table. She did not read it. The choice was not fear, or not only fear, it was respect. The day had already asked too much of her body, and whatever voice waited in that folded paper deserved more than a tired girl half dizzy from bean soup and ash. Miss Mirry had never opened a morning order casually. She washed her hands, cleared the table, and made the room ready. The dead, she used to say, had already been hurried once. There was no need to hurry them again. So Tova put on her coat and went outside. Evening had lowered itself over the property in blue layers. The creek beyond the walnuts ran fuller after the rain. speaking over stones in a voice that did not rise or fall for human events. She walked toward it carefully, avoiding the soft north ground, and stood on the bank where the roots held firm. Water moved past without keeping anything. It carried leaves, bits of grass, a pale feather, the reflected branches of walnut trees broken and mended in every ripple. Tova watched until her breathing slowed. Behind her, the studio was only a dark shape, with one thin line of stove light showing through a crack in the front window covering. It looked less abandoned now, though nothing visible had changed. She took the bracelet between two fingers and followed its pattern by touch. Over, under, turn, keep. The house had been waiting, and so had she. At first light, the handwriting waited on the table. Tova had slept badly but deeply, waking only when the stove gave a small metal sigh and surrendered the last of its heat. The front room held the kind of cold that did not move, it simply stood there. She rose with care, fed the stove 3 sticks of walnut, and watched until Flame took the paper and began speaking to the iron. Only then did she go into the workroom. The packet lay where she had left it, tied with black ribbon, its oilcloth wrapping opened beneath it like a dark leaf. Morning gathered along the south windows and fell across the table in clear slanted bands. Dust moved in that light, so did her breath. She knew the hand before she knew why. Not Miss Mary's hand, older, more formal. The letters stood narrow and upright, with long descenders and a deliberate pressure at the beginning of each line. But there was something in the spacing, in the careful saving of paper, in the way each word seemed to have been placed rather than written, that belonged to the same family of hands. Miss Mary had written labels that way, not quickly, not prettily, accurately. Tova untied the ribbon. The paper had been folded along the same creases so many times by the person who wrote it, and never once after that. She opened it slowly, flattening each panel with the side of her hand. There were 4 pages. At the top of the first, in ink browned to the colour of tea, were the words, "My dear one, whoever you are, if these pages have reached your hands, then the shop has outlived me, and so has the silence I kept inside it. I am writing from Galena in the winter of 1905, with snow along the window ledges and the river held dark between its banks. Dr. Matthew L. Greaves of Dubuque told me in October that the growth in my breast has moved beyond his instruments and beyond the surgeons in Chicago he once hoped might help me. He said 6 months with gentleness, perhaps less without it. I believed him because he did not look away when he said it. My name is Elspeth Voss Mercer. I was born Elspeth Johanna Voss in 1856 in a back room above my father's harness shop on Commerce Street. My father, Elias Voss, came to Galena in 1848 from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, bringing awls, needles, 3 German pattern books, and a wife named Johanna who could braid horsehair finer than any woman I ever saw. Her mother, Margarethe Klein, had carried that skill from Württemberg in 1839, hidden among linen, prayer cards, and 2 silver thimbles. My daughter, Ruth Elaine Mercer, born in 1881, learned the work before she learned to keep accounts. Her daughter, if God allows her one, may learn it too. 4 generations sit in these strands, though not all of them knew they were sitting together. The trade began failing here after the 23rd of April 1877, when fire took the East Livery Row and 17 horses with it. People who had once sent tail hair for memorial chains began to call the work morbid. Some blamed the braids as if remembrance had invited loss. Then came factory jewellery, mail order findings, and a new fashion that wished grief to be brief and invisible. By 1892, only widows, old cavalrymen, and farm women still came through my door. By 1898, even they came quietly, as though asking for memory were a shameful errand. For more than 30 years I kept the shutters half open and the sign painted. I repaired watch chains no one paid for on time. I braided hair from horses that had ploughed lead country fields, and from horses that had carried men to war and not brought them home whole. My husband, Nathaniel Mercer, served with an Illinois regiment in the war between the states and returned with a cough that never left him. My brother Elias Jr. died at Vicksburg in 1863, and my son Thomas went to Cuba in 1898 during the Spanish-American War and came home with fever in his blood. He lasted until the first hard frost, I have laid men in the ground and kept their names in paper labels because stone alone is too far away for some kinds of love. Now I will tell you what must be kept. Do not boil the hair. Heat clean water to 180 degrees and no higher, with 1 spoon of washing soda to 2 quarts if the hair has oil, less if it is already brittle. Soak 7 minutes for black or bay, 5 for grey, 3 for white. Rinse in water cooled by 1/3. Draw the strands through linen, never wool. Sort first by length, then gloss, then willingness. If the strand snaps when bent around a copper tube the width of a knitting needle, do not use it for the outer turn. Wind damp hair around copper and let it rest near warmth, not flame, for 2 hours. For barleycorn, keep 6 strands under equal weight and turn the disc toward your heart. For chevron, use 8 and cross the center pair only after counting twice. Beeswax must be warmed between the fingers. Silver hooks should be stitched before they are crimped. Gold knots are not decoration, they are promises. If you find the money, do not let it make you proud. It is only stored labor. Some of it came from women who paid in coins wrapped in handkerchiefs. Some from soldiers who wanted a chain for a wife before leaving. Some from my own husband who hid $10 at a time and told me a house should have breath in its walls. I put it here because banks close, men die, fashion changes and papers burn. Wood, if kept dry, can be more faithful than a lawyer. If you find the finished pieces, keep their labels with them. Never sell the story without the name. A braid separated from its name becomes ornament only, and ornament is too light a thing for the dead. These pieces belong to Galena as much as to me, but perhaps Galena has forgotten how to hold them. If you're the one who remembers, then remembrance has found a body again. Inheritance is not ownership first. It is attention. It is receiving the weight of what others could not finish and deciding without applause to carry it a little farther. I do not know whether you are my blood, my student, a stranger, or some hungry soul led here by a notice printed in small type. It does not matter as much as people think. The hand that keeps a thing alive becomes kin to it. There is a marker behind the house. Look for the iron horseshoe grown into the walnut tree nearest the creek. Beneath that tree, Nathaniel buried the first tail hair my mother braided in Galena from a grey mare called Mercy. I could not bear to move it when we closed the livery accounts. If the tree still stands, greet it for me. I have left a candle in the lower drawer, wrapped in blue cloth. It was poured the year Ruth was born. Light it only when you understand that you are not alone here. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elspeth Johanna Voss Mercer. January 14th, 1905. Tova read the letter once without moving. The second time she read it aloud, but barely. The room took the words in the manner of wood taking oil, slowly and with a darkening that made the grain appear. Her voice caught only once, at the sentence about stored labour, and then she stopped long enough to lay both hands flat on the table until they steadied. She did not cry over the money. She had not cried over the medal, or the gold coins, or the fine tools in stitched pockets, but the washing soda, the 7 minutes, the instruction to turn the disc toward the heart, those exact small fidelities opened something in her that had been held closed by necessity. A woman facing death had not written grand wisdom first. She had written temperatures, ratios, timings, the true grammar of care. After the second reading, Tova folded the pages along their original creases. She did not make new ones. She let the old lines guide the paper back into the shape it had held for more than a century. Then she tied the black ribbon loosely, not to imprison the letter again, but to keep its pages together until she could make a safer place. The lower drawer resisted when she opened it. Inside were scraps of tissue, 2 empty clasp envelopes, a piece of blue cloth stiff with age, and beneath it a candle the colour of old cream. It was short, hand-poured, and slightly uneven at the base. A loop of cotton wick lay against its top, flattened by the cloth. Tova lifted it with both hands, surprised by how fragile wax could feel when it had outlived the hands that made it. She did not light it yet. First, she went out the back door. It took the pry bar, patience, and one hard shoulder push to open the door far enough for her to pass. The yard behind the studio sloped toward the creek through walnut trees, sumac, and the dry stems of last summer's goldenrod. The air smelled of wet bark and cold soil. Morning had sharpened every edge, making the limestone foundation, the black branches, and the creek stones appear newly drawn. She looked for the walnut nearest the creek. There were 3 close together, each broad enough to have seen more lives than hers. The first held a broken limb angled toward the water. The second had a hollow at its base filled with leaves. The third leaned slightly south, and on its trunk, shoulder high, iron had entered wood. The horseshoe was still there. Not nailed to the surface anymore, not hanging as an object, but grown into the tree until bark had folded around the curve and held it like a scar. Only the outer arc and 1 nail hole remained visible, black iron against ridged grey-brown bark. Tova stood before it and took off her glove. The metal was colder than the morning. She placed her fingertips on the exposed curve and thought of a grey mare called Mercy, of tail hair braided by women whose names had travelled farther than their bodies, of Miss Miri fastening a narrow bracelet on a 16-year-old wrist. She did not know what kind of greeting Elspeth had wanted, so she gave the simplest one. "I found it," the creek answered over stones. She remained there until cold reached through the soles of her shoes, then returned to the studio by the same path, careful of the soft ground. Inside, she cleared the work table completely. The money stayed in the tin box, the jewellery lay covered, the tools rested in their stitched roll. At the centre, she placed the candle on a saucer from the front room. Its edge chipped but clean enough after boiling water and salt. She lit it with 1 match. The wick struggled first, bending into the wax as though uncertain it had permission to burn after so long. Then a blue point rose, yellowed, and became flame. It was small. It gave almost no heat. Still the room changed, not visibly perhaps to anyone passing a window, but the workroom altered around that one steady flame, as if every unfinished braid and labelled drawer had leaned an inch closer. The candle smelled faintly of tallow, beeswax, and age. Tova sat beside it until the wax pooled clear near the wick. She did not ask the dead for guidance. That would have been too easy and too cruel. The dead had already done their part. They had kept tools dry, money hidden, labels tied, and instructions exact. Guidance now would have to come through work, through roof patches, swept floors, boiled water, and the daily refusal to let the county's demolition order become the last sentence. The chain of small kindnesses returned to her one by one. Pastor Joel in Moline, standing at the edge of the church lawn with milk and boiled eggs, careful not to startle her into flight. Mrs. Annika Bell at the Rock Island Library, taking the backpack behind the reference desk as if it were a normal courtesy given to any patron. The waitress in Savannah with red shoes and no readable name tag, wrapping meatloaf in foil and pretending it had been made wrong. Margaret Hollis, sliding 1 worn dollar into a desk drawer and telling the ledger to look away without saying so. Amos Rusk writing account instead of debt. None of them had saved her alone. That was the point. A life was not usually carried by one grand rescue. More often it crossed ruin by stepping on small stones placed by people who might never know they were part of a bridge. If you're listening tonight from a warm room, or from a kitchen after the dishes are done, or from a bed where sleep has been difficult, maybe there is a small kindness you still remember, not the large kind people make speeches about. A ride given without questions, a sandwich wrapped in paper, a bill paid quietly, a door left unlocked at the right hour. If someone once placed 1 small stone in the water for you, write it down somewhere before the world teaches you to call it nothing. Names matter. So do the quiet acts that kept us from going under. Tova wrote the names again. Not on scrap paper this time, in the back of Elspeth's letter packet, on a blank inner fold that had protected the pages without carrying words. She did not write long explanations, only names, places, and the gift. Pastor Joel, Moline, milk, eggs, soap. Mrs. Annika Bell, Rock Island, backpack kept safe. Waitress in red shoes, Savannah, meatloaf sandwich. Margaret E. Hollis, Galena, $1 remembered. Amos Rusk, hardware store, account and manual. The list looked plain. It looked necessary. By evening the candle had burned down less than half an inch. Tova pinched it out with wetted fingers because wasting it felt like poor manners toward the past. Smoke rose in a thin thread and disappeared before reaching the rafters. She wrapped the candle again in its blue cloth and returned it to the lower drawer, not as it had been hidden before, but as something she would use with intention. Then she moved the heirlooms to the safest place she could make. The tin box went beneath a loose floorboard near the inner wall where the wood remained dry. The finished jewellery stayed in the shallow drawer of the work table covered by cotton and an old ledger board. The medal she placed inside the Bible for the night, between the pages of Psalms, not because she knew the proper custom, but because the book had carried her last dollars and could carry this too. The letter she kept beside her. When darkness came, she made a small meal of cornmeal and beans, then banked the stove as best she could. Outside, wind moved through the walnut branches. The exposed horseshoe waited by the creek, iron held inside living wood. The house creaked and answered itself, no longer strange in quite the same way. Tova lay on the folded apron with the letter packet under her right hand and the tool roll under her left. The heirlooms surrounded her not like riches but like witnesses: fine scissors, bone gauges, the chamois wrapped medal, the folded pages, 40 memorial pieces resting in their drawer with names still tied to them. She closed her fingers around the horsehair bracelet on her wrist and followed its pattern until the dark grew soft at the edges. Over, under, turn, keep. Sleep came slowly, but it came. The first snow came on December 4th, just after midnight, and measured 4 inches by dawn on the flat stones near the well. Tova woke to the absence of dripping. For one brief foolish breath, she believed the roof had healed itself in the night. Then she saw the white light pressed against the windows and understood that snow had only covered the wounds, making a temporary mercy out of cold. The studio looked smaller beneath it. The roofline softened. The walnut branches held narrow white ridges, and the lane disappeared under a clean sheet that made every danger seem buried instead of removed. She stood in the front doorway with her coat pulled tight and watched the world reduce itself to black trunks, white ground, grey sky, and the small brown shape of the building's own shadow. By noon, the first melt began where stove heat touched the upper boards. A drop fell into the washpan, then another. She took Amos Rusk's home repair manual from the counter and read the roof chapter 3 times, not quickly. The first reading gave her the names of things: rafters, sheathing, felt, coarse, flashing, drip edge, ridge cap. The second reading gave her the order in which mistakes could become leaks. The third reading gave her enough fear to move carefully. The studio roof measured 22 feet across the front and 38 feet from eave to rear wall, with a modest pitch that made climbing possible but not kind. The rear L added another 12 by 16 feet lower and worse off near the collapsed pipe. Amos had told her to calculate waste, overlap, and the cost of being wrong. She measured from a ladder borrowed against her account, writing numbers with numb fingers on the back of an invoice. 6 bundles of cedar shingles for the worst slopes first, 2 rolls of 15-pound felt, galvanized roofing nails 1 1/4 inch, a strip of step flashing near the chimney base, 2 lengths of drip edge, tar paper for temporary underlayment where the shingles could not yet be replaced, 1 used roof rake, 1 chalk line with blue powder, a borrowed hammer, because Amos said the one in the studio had a cracked eye and would teach her bad habits. When he saw her list, Amos read it once and crossed out 3 items. "You do not need pretty," he said. "I need dry." "You need dry enough." He went into the back room of the hardware store and returned with a roofing hatchet wrapped in a piece of flour sack. The handle had been worn smooth and dark where a hand had held it through years of weather. Its head had a hammer face on one side, a blade on the other, and a little gauge notch for setting exposure. "This was my uncle's," Amos said. "He roofed barns until his knees quit. I cannot buy that. I did not offer to sell it." She held the hatchet with both hands. "I can return it." "You can use it correctly. That is different." The skilled elder arrived the next morning without being asked by her. His name was Amon Price. He had once roofed church halls, barns, and 2 river warehouses before retiring into a narrow house behind the cemetery rise. He was 78, long-boned and stooped only when standing still, with a face cut by wind and a left hand missing the tip of its ring finger. He wore a brown canvas coat and carried a coffee tin full of nails he said were better than most sold now. Amos had sent him. Eamon denied this. "I was passing," he said. "There is no road behind the studio." Then I passed indirectly. He would not take pay. He would not take coffee because she had none fit to offer. He would accept silence if it was useful and questions if they were exact, that was all. For 11 days they worked the roof. Not all day weather chose the hours and their bodies chose the rest. Morning frost made shingles slick until sun reached them. Wind came across the open ground and found every sleeve cuff, every collar gap, every place warmth tried to remain. Tova learned to climb with 3 points held, to keep the hatchet looped, to place her weight over rafters, and to listen when old sheathing gave a note too soft for trust. Eamon did not praise, he corrected. "That nail's proud. Pull it." Line wandered. "I see it." "Then fix it." She learned sister rafters first because 2 rafters near the west leak had rotted where water followed old nail holes for years. Eamon made her cut the new pieces to match. Not almost, not close enough. They sistered them alongside the weakened rafters with carriage bolts and washers, tightening until the old timber and new took weight together. Then came the sheathing patches, boards measured, cut, fitted, lifted, cursed under breath, and finally nailed into place. The chalk line frightened her at first. It seemed too bright against the dark felt, too final. Eamon showed her how to snap it with one clean lift and release, not dragging, not hesitating. A crooked line made a crooked roof, he said, and a crooked roof told water where to laugh. The shingles followed that blue line course by course. She learned the 3-stroke nail, first to set, second to drive, third to seat without bruising the wood, too shallow and the shingle lifted, too hard and it split. Correct work had a sound. By the 5th day, her palms had blisters beneath blisters. By the 7th, she stopped fearing the height and began fearing carelessness instead, which Eamon said was improvement. On the 9th, snow threatened again, and they worked until dusk fastening felt over a section they could not shingle before dark. Eamon's breath came hard by then. He climbed down without speaking, sat on the chopping block near the back door, and looked at the roof as if it were a student who might yet learn. "You should rest," Tova said. "So should the dead." It was the longest joke he made all week. On December 15th, under a sky clean and hard as pewter, the last ridge cap went down on the front slope. Not the whole building restored, not even close. The rear L still needed spring work, and the chimney flashing was temporary at best. But the 3 patient places in the main roof no longer admitted rain. Snowmelt ran where it was supposed to run, sliding down shingles, striking the drip edge, and falling to earth beyond the sill. Eamon stood in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets. "Good enough to keep trying," he said. For him, it was a blessing. That night, no drop struck the washpan. Tova woke twice anyway, listening for water that did not come. January made the bricks confess. The chimney had looked merely tired from the yard, missing 2 courses near the top and wearing moss where shade kept moisture long after rain. But once the roof no longer demanded every hour, Tova could stand close and see the worst truths. Spalling bricks had shed their fired faces, leaving soft orange interiors exposed like bread, mortar powdered under her thumb. At the base where the stovepipe entered the flue, old cement had cracked into grey scales. A chimney did not have to fall to become dangerous. It only had to forget its shape. Amos examined it on a morning when the temperature stayed at 24 degrees and the sky hung low enough to make the whole county seem roofed. He did not climb. He stood back, looked from 3 angles, then scraped a joint with his pocket knife. "Do not use Portland cement on old brick," he said. "I read that." "Read it again." She did. The manual was cautious but incomplete, so Amos wrote a mortar recipe on butcher paper with his carpenter's pencil. 2 parts screened sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/2 part fireclay for the inner throat and smoke shelf repairs. Water added slowly until the mix held on a trowel without slumping. For exterior joints, no more than a little fireclay, because breath mattered. Hard mortar could break soft brick, The repair had to be weaker than the thing repaired, or it would win the wrong contest. He loaned her a pointing trowel, a hawk, and a joint raker. "Work small," he said. "How small?" "Smaller than your impatience?" For 3 weeks, she worked the chimney in temperatures that rarely climbed above the 20s. The first task was removal. She raked out failed joints to a depth of 3/4 of an inch where the brick remained sound, deeper where powder had replaced mortar entirely. Dust collected in her cuffs, fine grit found the cracked skin around her fingernails. Every 15 minutes her hands went numb, even inside gloves, and she had to climb down, stand near the stove and warm them without letting the heat sting too quickly back into pain. She learned to cover the work with burlap at night so the mortar would not freeze before curing. She learned that lime had a patient temperament and punished haste. Mixed too wet, it smeared and shrank. Too dry, it crumbled under the jointer, correctly mixed. It pressed into the joint with a steady resistance, took the tool mark, and sat there with a modest dignity. She misted bricks before applying it, because old brick pulled water greedily. She packed joints in layers. She struck them concave to shed rain. The inner work was more delicate. Near the stove collar, the smoke chamber had lost mortar where old heat and damp had worried it loose. She mixed the fire clay blend in a chipped basin, the colour darkening from beige to grey-brown as water entered. With a gloved hand and narrow trowel, she pressed the mix into gaps she could barely see, guided by touch and the manual's drawing. Her shoulder wedged against the stove, her cheeks streaked black. She worked until her breath fogged the iron. Some mornings began badly. On January 11th, she dropped the trowel from the ladder and watched it vanish into snow. On January 16th, the mortar froze in the bucket because she had misjudged the wind. On January 21st, the burlap blew loose overnight, and 2 joints had to be scraped out and redone. Emond passed once during that week, looked up at the chimney, and said nothing for so long she assumed the work had failed. Then he said, "Do not make the cap proud." "I won't." "You will if you like it too much. The top courses required replacement brick." Amos had salvaged a stack from a demolished summer kitchen outside Scales Mound, and he let her choose bricks close in size and firing to the originals. None matched perfectly. Exact matches belonged to people with money or time, and she had neither in abundance. But the colour was near enough, and the old brick accepted the new without looking insulted. She set the cap low and plain. On January 28th, the sky cleared after 3 days of grey. Tova waited until afternoon, when the mortar had taken enough set and the wind had dropped. She opened the stove draught, built a small fire of paper and kindling, and watched. Smoke rose. Not sideways, not into the room, not reluctantly. It drew clean through the pipe, up the flue and out above the repaired crown in a thin blue line that moved east with the wind. She went outside without a coat and stood in the snow looking up until cold forced sense back into her. The chimney did not look new. It looked able. That was better. The floors had been waiting under dirt, mouse leavings, spilled wax, rain stains, and time. Once the roof held and the chimney drew, Tova could begin trusting the rooms enough to kneel in them. She mapped the planks first, white pine in the front room, mostly 12 to 14 inches wide, with a few narrow replacements near the stove. The back room held denser boards worn by chairs, table legs, and decades of women standing at their work. Hand-cut rose-head nails held many of them, their heads irregular and dark, each one set by a hammer no living hand remembered. She did not pull those nails unless rot forced her. Old fastening had its own authority. The worst boards near the west wall came up in pieces. Under them she found damp insulation made of newspapers, straw, and mousework. She removed it with a shovel and mask, then let the cavity dry for 2 days with a little heat from the stove moving through the room. Amos sold her reclaimed pine from a barn loft at a price he wrote into the ledger without letting her see his face. The boards were not the same width, but they were old enough to speak the same language. She cut patches by hand because Power saw rental cost more than she could justify. The first patch fit poorly, the second fit better. By the fourth she had learned to plane the edge in little patient strokes, until the board settled without force. Eamon stopped once, watched her fit a piece near the counter, and tapped the high corner with his boot. Wood tells on you. I know. No, you're learning. In late January, Amos let her rent a random orbit sander for $14 a day. Account marked in green pencil because he said machines should be returned faster than debts. She planned the day with almost military care. Sweep, set nails, cover shelves, mask. Open windows only enough for dust to escape without letting snow blow in. Start in the front room, then back room. Do not rush the corners. 3 passes. 80 grit first to remove the grey raised grain and old surface bruises. The sander shuddered hard in her hands, and the first hour taught her that machines had wills of their own. If she leaned, it gouged. If she hesitated, it left a crescent mark. If she moved with the board, steady and even, the pine began to release its hidden colour. 120 grit came second. That pass softened the harshness left by the first and made the room smell of warm resin, dust, and something nearly sweet. The backroom boards changed under the sander as if waking from beneath a long sleep. Around the work tables where generations had stood, the floor had darkened deep, not dirt. Use the path between cabinets held the shadow of feet. 220 came last, slower, almost tender. By then her arms trembled and her ears rang, but she could not stop before the surface was ready. Fine dust settled on her eyelashes, her scarf, the Bible wrapped in cloth on the counter, and the largest loom covered near the window. The room became pale with it. When she finally turned the sander off, silence fell so quickly it seemed to have been waiting outside the door. She swept. Then swept again. Then wiped the boards with cloth until the cloth came away less grey. The finish was a mixture Amos advised after asking what the floor deserved, not what it could be made to display. Tung oil cut with a little citrus solvent for the first coat, then boiled linseed oil rubbed thin for the second and third. Each coat allowed 48 hours to cure. No varnish, no shine that would sit on top like a lie. The wood needed feeding, not sealing into a museum face. The first coat changed everything. White pine near the door darkened to honey. The back room turned deeper toward mahogany where feet and light had worked together over many years. Nail heads emerged like small black stars. The rose-head nails, once nearly hidden, caught the low sun in rough facets. The patched boards showed, but honestly, repair did not need to pretend it had never happened. The house had been waiting, and so had she. Then came the bad morning. It arrived without drama on the last day of January. She woke before dawn with the stove nearly out, her hands swollen from work, and a fatigue so complete that even sitting up felt like lifting wet cloth. Nothing in the room had changed. The floor needed another rub, the window putty waited, the ledger of expenses lay open with numbers she had no way to answer. Outside, the county road would still be there. Amos would still be kind. And kindness itself had begun to feel like another account she feared she could not repay. She put on her coat and left the work untouched. Beyond the creek, past the walnut line, the ground opened into a low marsh where cattails stood brown and broken above skim ice. She had seen it from the rise, but had not gone there before. That morning she walked until the studio disappeared behind trees, then sat on a fallen log with her boots in frozen grass. A great blue heron stood at the far edge of the water. It did not belong to the season, or perhaps she only thought so because she knew too little of birds. Tall grey-blue, severe as an old judge, it stood with one leg hidden, looking into the dark water as though reading something written below the surface. For nearly an hour, neither of them moved much. The heron shifted once. Tova breathed into her sleeves. The marsh held them both without comment. She did not work that day. She returned at dusk, ate cornmeal, banked the stove, and slept with the smell of oiled pine still rising from the floors. The next morning the work remained. It had not punished her by leaving. That was a lesson too. February entered through the windows before she repaired them. There were 8 in all. 2 front, 4 along the south wall of the workroom, 1 narrow window in the washroom, and 1 high window in the rear L. 3 had no glass in their lower panes, only cardboard and brittle cloth tacked across the openings. 4 were cracked, the fractures running from corner to corner like frozen lightning. One, the east and south window, nearest the largest loom, held its original wavy glass. Amos said not to replace it. 1878 glass, maybe earlier. How can you tell? It distorts the walnut tree like water. She looked through it. The branches outside bent and swam at the edges, their shape softened by the uneven pane. It made the world appear remembered instead of seen. That one stays, he said. So it stayed. He sold her salvaged panes from his storage loft and a can of DAP 33 glazing putty with a lid dented on one side. He added glazier's points, a stiff putty knife, a narrow scraper and a coil of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. The account grew. She wrote every item in her own notebook too, because debt named honestly felt less like a shadow. Window work was colder than roof work in a different way. Roof cold was large and obvious. Window cold crept into fingertips, wrists, the exposed strip between glove and sleeve. She removed the first sash from the front room by loosening the stops with the small pry bar, marking each piece of trim in pencil so it could return to its place. The sash cords had broken long ago, leaving the weights trapped inside the pockets when she opened the side panel. Dust breathed out, and the iron weight hung there like a secret that had never mattered to anyone. She threaded new cotton cord over the pulley, tied a figure-8 knot at the counterweight, and tested the drop twice before attaching it to the sash. The knot pleased her. It had a plain, reliable look, the kind of knot that expected no admiration and wanted only to hold. The glazing putty needed warming. She rolled it in her hands until it softened, then pressed a thin bed into the rabbet before setting the glass. Glazier's points went in carefully, not hard enough to crack the pane, just firm enough to hold. Then came the bevel. DAP 33 along the edge. Putty knife angled, one clean pull if she was lucky, 3 scraped attempts if not. The first window looked like a child's work, the second looked like a stubborn adult's. By the third, her hand began to understand the pressure. Amos inspected the fourth and ran one finger near the corner without touching. Water will sit there. I thought it was sloped. Thought wrong. She cut it out and did it again. The cracked panes were removed one by one, wrapped in newspaper, and stacked beside the shed for later disposal. She kept the largest pieces because old glass, even broken, might serve a smaller frame someday. Nothing useful was thrown without being asked what else it could become. The window with original glass required only putty and patience. She worked on it at midday when the sun came through and warmed the sash enough to keep the putty from stiffening too fast. The glass wavered with each movement of her hand outside. The walnut tree appeared to breathe through it. She cleaned the pane with vinegar water and newspaper, rubbing carefully around bubbles and faint lines trapped in the glass from its making. When she finished, the room did not look new. It looked seen. Light entered differently after that. The south wall brightened. The work tables cast clearer shadows. Labels in the cabinet drawers became easier to read without lifting them to the window. The looms, cleaned now and covered when not in use, stood in a steadier kind of daylight. Dust still existed. Cracks remained in plaster. The washroom pump still refused to move, but the wind no longer crossed the room with the same authority. The last window was the narrow one in the washroom. It had no glass at all when she began, only a board wedged into the frame and a nest abandoned behind it. She removed the board on a mild afternoon near the end of February, when snow on the south side of the foundation had softened into dark patches of earth. The opening looked out toward the walnut branch nearest the back door. As she set the salvaged pane into fresh putty, a chickadee landed on that branch. It weighed almost nothing. A cap of black, cheeks white, body round against the cold, it tilted its head toward her, then toward the window frame, as if judging the work. Tova held still with the putty knife in her hand. The bird hopped once, shook a little snowmelt from the twig, and gave 2 bright notes that entered the room through the open sash. Then it flew. She finished the bevel in one careful pull. By evening, all 8 windows held against the wind, 3 with salvaged glass, 4 with cracks stabilized or replaced, 1 original left in place like a kept promise. Tova closed each sash, tested each cord, latched what could be latched, and stood in the back room as the late light came through every pane the building still owned. The studio was not restored, but it had begun to answer care with shelter. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, Tova finished the first piece she allowed herself to call complete. Snow had come early that year, not heavily, but often enough to keep the walnut roots white and the lane marked by narrow tracks from Amos Rusk's truck, Doris Bell's cafe car, and Caleb's bicycle when he insisted the road was not too slick for a person with balance. The studio held heat by then, not perfectly. Old buildings kept their opinions, but the stove drew clean. The windows held their cords, the roof no longer answered rain with surrender, and the repaired floorboards gave back a low, familiar note beneath her feet. The bracelet lay on white cotton under the south window. It was not made from any historic bundle, not from the labelled drawers, not from the mourning pieces entrusted to the past. Tova had ordered new horsehair from a woman in Wisconsin whose grey mare had died at 31 after carrying 3 children through their first riding lessons and 1 father through the season after his wife's funeral. The woman had sent the tail hair wrapped in tissue with a letter so plain it took Tova longer to read than if it had been sorrowful on purpose. The hair was silver with a dark underlayer. Tova sorted it by length, gloss, and willingness, hearing Miss Mirry's old word as clearly as if it had come from the stove corner. She heated clean water to 180 degrees and watched the thermometer as though the whole craft might leave again if she looked away. 7 minutes would have been too long for that hair. She chose 5.5, then rinsed in water cooled by 1/3, drew the strands through linen, and wound them around copper tubes near the stove, never near the flame. The pattern was barleycorn. 6 strands, equal weight, disc turned toward the heart. Her fingers knew more than they had 2 winters before, but not so much that she trusted them blindly. Trust, she had learned, was not the opposite of caution. It was what caution became after being practiced honestly. She counted twice before crossing. She loosened one strand when it pulled against the others. She cut nothing until the braid had rested overnight. The silver clasp was modest, old stock from the cabinet, cleaned but not polished past its age. When she fastened the final knot, the room remained plain. No one applauded, no one photographed it. Outside, a crow crossed the field and vanished behind the chimney. Inside, the bracelet lay in the winter light with the quiet authority of work that had been given enough time. Tova wrote the label by hand. For Marin Vale, from the Tale of Juniper, Grey Mare, remembered December 2024. She tied the label with black thread, placed the bracelet in a small cotton-lined box, and sat very still for a long while after the lid closed. The first finished piece did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a promise finally spoken aloud. By then the studio no longer looked abandoned, though it had not been made fashionable. The front room held the repaired display case, its cracked corner stabilized with a narrow brass brace Amos had shaped at his workbench. Inside were only a few pieces, because Tova refused to crowd remembrance. The counter had been sanded just enough to remove splinters, leaving ink rings and blade marks visible beneath oil. On the wall, the 1978 calendar remained open to November, framed now behind salvaged glass, not as decoration, but as evidence that interruption had once lived there. The stove sat black and clean on its slate. Beside it stood a basket of walnut kindling, split evenly by Caleb on Saturday mornings before he went to the feed store for his own work. The chair with the broken cane seat had been repaired by Reverend Boyd's cousin, who knew rush weaving and accepted only 2 jars of apple butter from Doris in payment. The shelves behind the counter held ledgers, cotton boxes, spare clasp envelopes, and the blue-covered repair manual with its cracked spine. The workroom was still the truest room. The south windows gave their generous light. The largest loom stood where it had always stood, its cedar plug replaced but not hidden, because secrecy had served its purpose, and now honesty had work to do. The smaller looms had been cleaned and waxed. The shallow drawers were labelled again. New paper beside old where the old could not safely be handled. Bay, black, chestnut, grey, washed, unsorted, memorial archive, tools, labels. The 40 historic pieces were not displayed casually. Tova had made a flat archival cabinet from salvaged maple and lined each drawer with acid-free paper ordered in one careful shipment after selling only 3 pieces of new work. Each memorial braid remained with its label. Names stayed attached, stories stayed near the objects that carried them. Once a month she opened one drawer, read every name in it aloud, and closed it again. No advertisement mentioned them. Some things were not bait. The brass key stayed on the mantel through those 2 winters. It had been found in the small oak box under the 3rd cellar step before she understood what it opened, before she understood that not all secrets asked to be forced. The key had a bow shaped like a braided loop, 2 strands crossing and returning to themselves. Beside it sat the tintype from 1903, propped in a narrow stand Caleb had carved from walnut. The young woman in the photograph stood before the same cottage with Tova's face, made older by another century's clothes, holding a tension hook in one hand. On the back, the ink had named her. Ruth Elaine Mercer, daughter of Elspeth Voss Mercer, age 25, summer of 1903. Tova did not keep the photograph where customers could see it. It lived near the stove, turned slightly away from light, close enough that she passed it several times a day without making ceremony of it. Kinship had become less a thunderclap than a steady daily fact. Water boiled, hair dried. The stove needed ash removed. Ruth watched from her brown photograph and did not explain herself. The key waited longer. The answer came on a thawing afternoon in late February, when snow had melted around the walnut nearest the creek and the iron horseshoe in the trunk showed more of its old curve than usual. Tova had gone out to gather fallen branches and found a strip of bark loosened beneath the horseshoe. Not broken, but lifted slightly along one edge. At first she thought frost had done it, then she saw brass. A plate no wider than 3 fingers had been set into the living wood long ago, and the tree had grown around it as it had grown around the horseshoe. Only a narrow keyhole remained visible beneath a lip of bark. She went back for the mantel key. It entered with difficulty, not because the lock rejected it, but because time had thickened everything around the metal. She worked slowly, a drop of oil from Amos's can, a rest, another slight turn. The brass plate shifted inward with a sound so soft the creak nearly covered it. Behind it, in a hollow protected by iron bark and a craftsman's stubborn faith, lay a folded oilcloth packet. Inside was a flag. Not large, not parade-sized, but carefully folded into a triangle. Its cotton, darkened by age 48 stars, sat in staggered rows on the blue field, which meant it could not have been Elspeth's first hiding. It belonged to a later hand. Beneath the flag was a note written in Miss Meary's script, firmer than Tova remembered from the labels, but unmistakable once she saw the long downward sweep of the capital M. My dear one, whoever you are, if you found Elspeth's letter, then you know this house chooses slowly. I am Mirella Ruth Mercer, granddaughter of Ruth Elaine and great-granddaughter of Elspeth, writing in 1944, while the radio brings war into every kitchen and boys from Joe Daviess County leave by train with mothers standing on platforms until steam hides them. This flag was given to me after my brother Samuel Mercer died in France in July of this year. He was 26. He said before he left that if he did not come back, I should not make a shrine of him. He said to keep working. I have tried. I put the flag here because grief should breathe, but it should not be handled by every passerby. If you're the next keeper, take it out when you know where honor belongs, not on a wall for strangers, not in a box forgotten, somewhere between. The key was made by Mr. Alwyn Price, whose son came home without his left hand and still learned to build cabinets. The braid shape is for Elspeth, the hiding place is for Ruth, the flag is for Samuel. Keep the names with the things. Mirella Ruth Mercer, November 11th, 1944. Tova carried the packet back inside with both hands. She placed the flag on the work table, still folded, and set Miss Meary's note beside Elspeth's letter. 2 women now spoke across the years in the same opening words, not because they had known who would hear them, but because welcome had become a family method. The first letter had kept a house from becoming empty. The second had kept grief from becoming display. On May 30th, Memorial Day, she took the Grand Army of the Republic Medal to Greenwood Cemetery in Galena. She did not make a public matter of it. Amos drove because the road would have been too far to walk while carrying the medal case and the little folded note she had written. Doris came too, bringing a thermos of coffee and 3 biscuits wrapped in cloth. Reverend Boyd met them at the cemetery gate. Caleb arrived late on his bicycle, breathless, pretending he had not hurried. The cemetery lay high enough to see the town and the folded land beyond it. They found the older stones near a slope where Civil War veterans rested beneath markers worn by weather but not erased. Tova had spent 3 evenings at the library and 2 mornings in county records matching initials, service dates and family names. Evie had belonged to Elias Voss Jr., Elspeth's brother, killed in 1863, and later remembered by the family when the medal came into their keeping through a veteran's post. The exact path of it remained uncertain, as many family paths do, but the name was close enough to be treated with care. She laid the medal in a small archival case near the stone, only for the length of a prayer. Reverend Boyd removed his hat. "Lord, keep memory honest." 4 words. That was all. Then Tova took the medal back. Honor did not require abandonment. The case returned to the studio that afternoon, where it rested in the archive drawer with its note, its year, and the record copies that explained what could be known and what could only be held gently. The money remained mostly where it had been found, not in the loom, because damp and secrecy had done their century's labor, but not in a bank account emptied into ordinary life either. Tova spent 3 coins in those first years. 1 worn Morgan dollar paid the registration fee for a small business license after a coin dealer in Dubuque gave her a careful written valuation and told her to sell nothing quickly. 1 Barber $half, 2 worn for collectors to mourn, helped by the first order of acid-free paper. 1 Indian head cent went into the wall behind the repaired counter, wrapped with a note in her own hand, because Amos said every building deserved a witness sealed inside it. The rest stayed together. Bills, coins, gold, records and valuations were placed in a fireproof chest. Amos found through a retired banker and insisted she purchase properly, not through account kindness. The chest sat beneath the workroom table bolted to the floor framing, not because money was sacred, but because stored labor deserved protection from both theft and foolishness. Tova wrote on the inside of the chest lid, "For the next one." She did not mean an heir in the legal sense. She did not know whether she would have children, students, apprentices, or only some future hungry person led there by small print and a last coin. That uncertainty no longer frightened her. The hand that keeps a thing alive becomes kin to it. Elspeth had written that, and the sentence had worn a path through Tova's days until she could walk it without looking down. The shop reopened quietly. Not with a ribbon, not with an article, not with a crowd standing under the faded sign. Doris Bell put an index card on the cafe corkboard between a notice for firewood and a handwritten advertisement for piano lessons. Voss Horsehair Works. Memorial braids and keepsake chains. By appointment. No rush orders. Below it, Tova had written a post office box, not the lane address. She did not want strangers arriving unannounced at the studio. Not yet. Work that touched grief needed a door opened deliberately. The first week, no one wrote. The second week, a woman from Elizabeth sent a note about a chestnut gelding named Peter, who had carried her daughter after a surgery when walking hurt. The third week, a widower from Warren asked whether horsehair from a mane could be used if the tail had been cut too short. The fourth week, 3 envelopes arrived together, one from Dubuque, one from Platteville, one from a ranch outside Freeport. By spring, the mailing list held 43 names written in Tova's ledger, each with a careful note beside it. No order was accepted without a conversation. She asked the animal's name. She asked whether the piece was meant for daily wear or a box. She asked if the owner wanted the label to include a date, a farm, a phrase, or only the name. She said no to anyone who asked for novelty. She said no to speed. She said yes to repairs when she could, and when she could not, she explained why. The work grew slowly enough to remain itself. Doris was paid in candles when the shop reopened, just as she had once demanded through brown paper bags left on the doorstep. Amos's ledger shrank by pieces. Eamon accepted one repaired watch chain and pretended it was not payment. Reverend Boyd brought no orders, only news of people who might need gentleness and would not ask for it plainly. Caleb kept coming by with split wood, errands and questions that arrived disguised as complaints. By the second winter, Caleb was taller than the counter. He had grown into his wrists mostly, and wore his hair longer because his mother disliked it, and he liked choosing one harmless battle. He had taken to carving in the evenings, first spoons, then shelf pegs, then a little bird that sat for 3 months near the stove because nobody knew whether it was finished. On a cold Saturday in January, he arrived carrying a long object wrapped in an old quilt. "Made something," he said. Tova looked up from sorting grey hair. "For the woodpile?" "No." "For your mother?" "No." "For someone who knows what it is?" He gave her a narrow look. "You are worse than Amos." The object was a sign. Not large, not polished to a shine. Carved from walnut, its edges left slightly irregular, its letters cut deep and filled with black milk paint. He had copied the old words from the faded board above the door, but added what time had taken too long to admit. Voss Horsehair Works. Daughters. Plural. Tova ran her thumb along the carved ampersand. It curled like a strand crossing back toward itself. The word daughters sat steady beneath the older name, not apologizing for arriving late. "I can change it," Caleb said too quickly. "If it is wrong." She shook her head. Outside, wind moved through bare branches. Inside, the stove gave a soft settling sound, and the south windows held the afternoon light in 8 uneven squares. "It is not wrong." Caleb looked at the floor, pleased and embarrassed enough to become almost angry. "Needs oil." "Yes, I brought oil." "Of course you did." They finished it together on the work table with thin coats rubbed into the grain. The walnut darkened from brown to deep honey black. When Amos came 2 days later with screws and a level, he inspected the sign for a long time and told Caleb the spacing was tolerable, which from Amos meant the boy would remember the praise for years. They hung it below the original faded board, not over it. The old sign remained, the new one answered. That night, after Caleb had gone home and the road had quieted, Tova took out a sheet of good paper from the drawer where she kept labels and letters. The stove was banked low. The repaired windows reflected the room behind her, counter, loom, cabinet drawers, walnut sign visible through the open front door where it leaned in the entry to finish drying. On the table lay Elspeth's letter, Miss Mary's note, and a blank page. She sharpened a pencil first. Then she chose ink. The opening came before she was ready, but perhaps openings always had. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote the words slowly, not copying, not pretending to be the women before her, but entering the same room they had left unlocked. The letter was not meant to be finished in one night. She knew that. It would need years. It would need instructions she had earned rather than inherited. How to judge when grey hair had become too brittle for 6-strand work. How to tell a customer that grief could not be rushed without making them feel scolded. How to oil pine floors in winter. How to keep a roof honest. How to spend only what must be spent. How to receive kindness without turning it into debt. She wrote one paragraph, then another. She did not mention revenge because none had occurred. She did not mention the committee, the dorm room, the silent car, or the cracked lamp. Those things belonged to the road that brought her here, not the house she was now charged with keeping. The next one would have their own road. They would need bread, instructions, names, and the knowledge that welcome could be hidden inside difficult wood. Near midnight, she stopped and read what she had written. "My dear one, whoever you are, if this page has reached your hands, then the studio has once again outlived someone who loved it. I am Tova Elaine Mercer, writing in the winter of 2024, with snow against the north wall and walnut smoke in the stove. I found this place when I had almost nothing left except a bracelet and the habit of keeping my hands busy. The house did not rescue me quickly, it gave me work slow enough to survive." She set the pen down. The house was patient, so was she. Outside, the walnut tree by the creek held iron, brass, bark, and the memory of a grey mare named Mercy. The creek moved under winter ice where it could, around it where it must. The sign dried in the entry. The first finished bracelet waited in its cotton-lined box for mailing. The 40 old memorial pieces slept in their drawers with names still attached. The money remained sealed for the next one. The flag rested folded in darkness, not forgotten. The medal kept its year. On the mantel, the brass key lay beside the old candle wrapped in blue cloth. Tova rose, crossed the room, and touched the key once before closing the stove draft for the night. She did not need to hold it. Knowing where it belonged was enough. In the morning she would walk to town with Marin Vale's bracelet boxed in brown paper, tied with cotton string, and labelled in her careful hand. She would stop at the cafe because Doris had been saving soup bones again. She would return Amos's level, though he would say he had not missed it. She would ask Caleb whether the sign needed another coat. She would come back before dusk, because old roads asked for daylight, and she had learnt to respect what asked plainly. But that was morning. For now, the studio settled around her with its repaired roof, its breathing chimney, its oiled floors, its wavy glass, and its long memory of women who had made grief small enough to hold. The Horsehair jewellery studio waits, it has always waited, and in the county clerk's office, in the centre drawer beneath a ruler, and beside a tin of paper clips, one worn dollar bill still lay flat where Margaret Hollis had placed it. The bill had softened further at the folds. Its corners had curled slightly. New receipts had passed above it. New files had been stamped. New people had stood at the glass asking for licenses, deeds, permissions, records. Mrs. Hollis had never spent it. When asked once by a younger clerk why old money was sitting loose in her drawer, she had put one finger on the bill and smiled without showing her teeth. "Proof of consideration," she said. Then she closed the drawer gently, leaving the dollar in the dark, where even paper can remember the day a forgotten place was bought for less than a cup of coffee, and a life that had been nearly erased found its way back into the keeping of patient hands.